Welcome. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let the day you have just finished begin to drift away from you. There is nothing left to do tonight, nothing left to fix or finish or remember. The world has gone quiet, and you are exactly where you're meant to be. Tonight, we're going to spend a little time inside the world of the American housewife in the 1940s. Not the headlines of that decade, not the wars and the speeches and the great events, only the small, warm, ordinary world of a woman in a kitchen, in a small house, in a town that almost no one remembers. The kind of life that filled most of the country and most of those years, lived quietly, day after day, through small acts of patience and care. Imagine, if you would, a kitchen in the early hours of a spring morning in 1943. The light outside is still soft and grey, the kind of pale silver light that comes before sunrise, when the world has not quite woken and the air still carries the cool of the night. The kitchen window faces east, and the first hint of pink is just beginning to gather along the rooftops of the houses across the street. A robin somewhere out in the yard is testing its voice against the silence. Inside, the kitchen is small and warm. A coal stove in the corner has been banked through the night, and the woman of the house has just woken it back up, opened the dampers, fed it a little kindling, and now it is humming again with that low contented sound a stove makes when it is doing its work. The kettle is sitting on the back of the stove, slowly coming up to a boil. The smell of coffee, real coffee, saved and rationed and measured, is just beginning to bloom in the room. She moves through the kitchen the way only someone who has lived in a place for a long time can move, without looking, without hurrying, without thinking. Her hand finds the cup, her hand finds the spoon, her hand finds the small tin of sugar she keeps near the stove and measures out one careful spoonful, because sugar is precious and you do not waste it, even on yourself, even in the quiet of the morning when no one is watching. The radio in the next room is on, turned low the way she always keeps it. A man is reading the morning news in that calm, steady voice the radio men of that era all seemed to have. She is not really listening. The voice is just there, a soft companion, the way a clock ticking is a companion, the way a cat sleeping in a chair is a companion, the way the ordinary sounds of an ordinary house become, after enough years, a kind of music you only notice when it stops. She pours her coffee and stands for a moment at the window, holding the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her palms. Outside, the street is still empty. The milk truck has not come yet. The newspaper has not come yet. The neighbours are still asleep behind their drawn curtains. For these few minutes, the world belongs only to her. This is where our story begins. Not with anything dramatic, not with anything that demands your attention, only with a woman in a kitchen, at the beginning of an ordinary day, in a year now long past. And we will stay close to her, and to the women like her, for the next little while, letting their world settle around us, letting their patience become our patience, letting their slow, careful rhythms become a place where the mind can rest. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Now let us begin. The houses of that time were small by the standards we're used to now. Most of them sat close to the street, close to their neighbours, close enough that you could hear the faint sound of someone next door winding a clock or closing a cupboard or scolding a cat. They were modest houses, made of clapboard and brick and shingle, painted in soft pale colours that had often faded into something gentler still, the white that had become almost cream, the green that had become almost grey, the blue that had become almost the colour of the sky on an overcast afternoon. A house like this had a front porch, almost always. A wooden porch with a few painted boards, a railing worn smooth by years of hands, and a swing or a rocking chair or sometimes both. The porch was a kind of in-between place, a small soft border between the privacy of the home and the openness of the street. In summer, the woman of the house might sit there in the late afternoon shelling peas into a bowl, or mending a torn sleeve, or simply rocking and watching the children of the neighbourhood ride their bicycles up and down the sidewalk. The porch caught the breeze. The porch caught the sound of the cicadas. The porch was where you greeted the neighbours when they walked by, and where you saw the seasons change slowly year after year. The front door opened directly into the parlour, which is the room we would now call the living room. The parlour was the public room of the house, the room where guests were received, and where the family gathered in the evenings. It was usually the most carefully kept room, with a rug on the floor and curtains at the windows and a few cherished pieces of furniture. A wing chair, perhaps, upholstered in a fabric that had been chosen carefully and was now showing the faintest signs of wear along the arms. A small sofa with a crocheted blanket folded neatly over its back. A side table with a lamp on it, and a doily under the lamp, and a small frame photograph on top of the doily. The photographs in a parlour told the story of the household at a glance. A wedding portrait from years ago, the bride and groom looking solemn, the way people in old photographs always look solemn, because holding still for the camera was difficult, and smiling for so long was harder still. A picture of the children, perhaps, taken at school or at a summer fair, or by an itinerant photographer who came through the town one autumn with a camera and a cloth backdrop. A photograph of a brother or a son in uniform standing very straight, looking very young. These photographs were dusted every week and never moved. The walls of the parlour were usually covered in wallpaper, patterned in flowers or small repeating shapes, in colours that had softened with years of sunlight. Above the wallpaper, near the ceiling, ran a picture rail, a thin wooden moulding from which a few framed pictures hung on long cords. There might be a print of a famous painting, a country landscape, a bowl of fruit, a sailing ship on a calm sea. There might be a small framed sampler, embroidered by the woman of the house when she was a girl, with the alphabet stitched across the top, and a verse beneath it and her own name, and the year she'd finished it stitched along the bottom in careful red thread. Beyond the parlour was the dining room, though in many houses the parlour and the dining room were really one room, divided only by an arch or a curtain, or simply by the placement of the furniture. The dining table was the heart of the house in many ways. It was where the family ate, of course, but it was also where the children did their homework after supper, spreading their books out under the lamplight. It was where the woman of the house wrote her letters and balanced her ledger book, and sometimes laid out fabric for sewing when she did not feel like setting up the machine in the back bedroom. The table was usually covered with a tablecloth, a cotton one for every day, and a starched white one for Sundays, and there was almost always a small vase or a bowl in the centre of it, with whatever flowers were in season or in winter, with a few pine cones or an arrangement of dried grass and seed pods gathered from the yard. The kitchen was the room where the woman of the house spent most of her hours. It was usually at the back of the house, with a window that looked out on the yard and a door that opened onto a small back porch or a set of wooden steps. The kitchen was where the work was done, and the kitchen showed it, in the small worn places along the edge of the counter where her elbow had rested 10,000 times, in the soft hollow worn into the wooden floor in front of the stove, in the slight darkening of the wall behind the sink where steam had risen day after day for years. The stove was the centre of everything. In the early 40s, in a house like this, it was usually a coal stove or a wood stove, though in the cities and in the newer houses there were already gas stoves and electric stoves coming into common use. A coal stove had to be tended. It had to be fed and damped and emptied of ashes. It had to be coaxed into a steady heat for cooking, and then banked at night to keep a low fire going until morning. A woman who cooked on a coal stove knew her stove the way a sailor knows his boat. She knew where the heat was strongest and where it was gentlest. She knew which corner of the cast iron was right for a slow simmer, and which was right for a fast boil. She knew the small adjustments that would bring a pot of beans to the perfect tender softness, without scorching them on the bottom. Around the stove, the kitchen unfolded in a pattern that had been settled long ago. The icebox, sometimes a true icebox with a block of ice delivered weekly by the iceman, sometimes by the early 40s an electric refrigerator, hummed quietly in the corner. The sink was usually a deep enamelled basin set into a wooden counter, with a small window above it that looked out on the yard. The cupboards were painted, white usually, or pale yellow, or sometimes a soft green. They held the everyday dishes, the cups, the bowls, the few good plates that came out only on Sundays and holidays. The drawers held the silverware, the linen napkins, the dish towels, and 100 small things, twine and pencils and spare buttons and folded paper bags saved for some future use. There was almost always a kitchen table, smaller than the dining room table, painted or oil-clothed, where the woman of the house did most of her preparation work. She rolled out pie dough on this table, and shelled peas, and snapped beans, and cut up chickens, and kneaded bread. The table held a canister set, a row of tin or ceramic containers labelled flour and sugar and coffee and tea. It held a salt cellar and a pepper mill. It held a small cracked plate that was used as a spoon rest. Everything had its place. Everything was where it had always been. And the woman of the house could find anything in this kitchen in the dark, with her eyes closed, by the simple memory of her own hands. Off the kitchen, through a doorway, was the pantry. The pantry was its own small kingdom. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with the careful work of the previous summer and fall, mason jars of tomatoes, deep red, lined up in rows, jars of green beans and corn and peaches and pears, jars of jam, strawberry and blackberry and grape, jars of pickles, dill and bread and butter and watermelon rind, jars of apple butter, slow cooked over a low fire until it was dark and rich and almost black. Each jar was labelled in the woman's own handwriting with the name of what was inside and the month and year it had been put up. The pantry was a record of her year. The pantry was a record of her labour. The pantry was the proof, sitting there in glass and shadow, that she had taken the wild abundance of summer and turned it into something the family could eat in February. The bedrooms of the house were upstairs, usually, reached by a narrow wooden staircase that creaked in two specific places, the third step from the bottom and the second step from the top, which the woman knew so well that she could come down in the dark without waking anyone. There were usually 2 or 3 bedrooms. The largest belonged to the woman and her husband. The smaller ones belonged to the children, often 2 or 3 children in a single room, sleeping in 2 beds or in a bunk bed pressed against the wall. The beds were made up with quilts that had been pieced together from scraps of old clothing, every square a memory. This one from a dress she had worn before she was married, this one from her son's first pair of long pants, this one from a shirt her father had given her years ago. To sleep under such a quilt was to sleep under your own family history. The bedrooms were simple: a bed, a small dresser with a mirror above it, a chair in the corner where clothes were laid out for the morning. A washstand sometimes, with a basin and a pitcher of water, though most houses had a bathroom by the 40s, even if it was small and old and a little draughty. The closets were narrow and clothes were not kept in great quantity. A woman might own 3 dresses for housework, 1 good dress for church, 1 nicer dress for special occasions, and a coat. That was often enough. Each garment was cared for, mended when it tore, washed by hand when it was delicate, hung out on the line to dry in the sun. The bathroom, when there was one, was a small room with a clawfoot tub or a porcelain tub with a shower curtain hanging from a metal frame, a porcelain sink with 2 separate taps for hot and cold, and a toilet with a wooden seat. The walls were sometimes tiled halfway up, sometimes painted, sometimes papered with a moisture-resistant pattern. There was a small medicine cabinet above the sink, with a mirror on the front, and inside it the modest collection of household remedies, a bottle of iodine, a tin of bandages, a jar of cold cream, a comb, a hairbrush, a tube of toothpaste, a few hairpins lying in the corner of a small dish. The cellar beneath the kitchen was reached by a narrow door and a steeper set of stairs. The cellar was cool and dim, with stone walls or concrete walls, and a single bulb hanging from a cord. Down here was the coal bin, and the furnace, and the laundry tubs, and another set of shelves for storing potatoes and onions and apples and squash. The cellar smelled of earth and coal dust and old wood. It was the foundation of the house in every sense, the place where the things that fed and warmed the family were kept. And outside, behind the house, was the yard. Not a lawn the way we think of lawns now, with its uniform green and its neat edges. The yard of a 40s house was a working space. There was usually a small patch of grass, yes, but most of the yard was given over to other purposes. A vegetable garden, certainly, sometimes an enormous one, taking up half the space behind the house. A clothesline strung between 2 wooden posts or between the porch and the garage, where the laundry hung in the sun on wash day. A small hen house, perhaps, with 3 or 4 chickens scratching in the dirt around it. A tool shed, a wood pile, a stack of empty crates, a rain barrel under the gutter to catch the water that came off the roof. And beyond the yard, the alley or the back lane, with its line of garages and the sound of someone else's dog barking and the soft, far-off rattle of a streetcar 3 blocks over. The neighbourhood folded outward from the kitchen window in soft concentric circles, each layer connected to the next by the small daily errands and the small daily kindnesses that wove a community together. The woman knew every house she could see from her back porch. She knew who lived in each one and how long they had been there, and what their children's names were and which ones had a son in the service. This was the world she moved through. This was the geography of her days. The kitchen, the parlour, the bedrooms, the pantry, the cellar, the yard, the porch, the street, the neighbourhood. A small world by some measures, a whole world by others, and every corner of it was hers, in the sense that her hands had touched every surface and her care had shaped every room. She was the one who kept the house warm and clean and fed and quietly humming with life. And the house, in return, gave her a place to belong, a place that knew her, a place that fit her shape the way only a long-lived-in home can fit the shape of the person who lives in it. So as we settle into this story, settle also into the feeling of being inside such a house. Feel the wooden floor beneath your feet. Feel the warmth of the kitchen at your back. Feel the soft silence of the bedrooms above you and the cool stillness of the cellar below. The walls hold you. The roof shelters you. The small rooms gather you in. And outside the windows, the world is doing what it has always done. The milkman coming up the street. The birds singing in the elm tree. The sky turning slowly from grey to rose as the sun begins to climb. You are home. You are safe. There is nothing you need to do. There are sounds in such a house that belong to nothing else. The soft tick of the wind-up clock on the mantelpiece, slow and patient, marking off the seconds with a kind of woodenness. The whisper of curtains stirring at a half-open window when a small breeze comes through. The deep, slow groan of the floorboards somewhere overhead when the house settles. The way old houses always settle, sighing into themselves at the end of a long day. The faint hum of the refrigerator, if there is one, that low electric note that becomes part of the silence, that you only ever hear when it stops. The kitchen smelled of certain things in certain seasons. In the spring, of soap and rising bread, and the green smell of the first lettuce coming in from the garden. In the summer, of tomatoes simmering on the stove and corn boiling in a tall pot, and basil cut from the kitchen window box. In the autumn, of apples cooked down for sauce and cinnamon, and the deep earthy smell of pumpkins being prepared for pie. In the winter, of soup on the stove all afternoon, and bread in the oven, and the warm, dry smell of the radiators, or the coal stove keeping the cold pressed politely against the windows. The way light fell in the rooms of such a house was its own quiet wonder. In the morning, the kitchen filled with that pale, clear light that comes through east-facing windows, washing across the table and the floor in long, soft rectangles. By midday, the parlour at the front of the house caught the south light, slanting through the lace curtains and printing their pattern on the rug in shifting shadows. In the late afternoon, the bedrooms upstairs glowed gold for an hour or two as the sun moved west, and the dust motes drifted in the slow currents of warm air, suspended like small bright stars. By evening, the lamps came on, soft yellow electric bulbs in their cloth shades, or sometimes still a kerosene lamp kept for emergencies and for the small ritual of certain quiet evenings, and the rooms grew warmer and more enclosed, the windows turning to dark mirrors that held only the reflection of the lamp itself, and the woman moving slowly through her last tasks of the day. The bones of the house were old wood and plaster and lath. The walls, if you tapped them, would give back a soft, solid sound. The sound of horsehair plaster keyed into thin wooden strips, a kind of construction that no one builds anymore. The floors were oak or maple or pine, depending on what part of the country you were in, and they had been polished by 1,000 sweepings and waxings until they had taken on that deep, mellow shine that only old wood can hold. The ceilings were high in the older houses, sometimes 9 or 10 feet, with a single bulb hanging from a fabric cord in the centre of each room, and the corners far overhead always slightly in shadow, slightly mysterious, the way the corners of a child's bedroom are always slightly mysterious at night. Each window had its own personality. The kitchen window above the sink, framed by a starched gingham curtain, with a small pot of African violets on the sill in winter, and a mason jar of cut flowers in summer. The parlour window with its heavy drapes pulled back during the day to let in the sun, and a small table beneath it bearing a sewing basket or a stack of magazines or the family Bible. The bedroom windows upstairs with their thin lace panels, and the soft summer breeze that came through them at night, smelling of cut grass and someone's neighbour's roses, and the faintest hint of the river, or the lake, or the railroad tracks at the edge of town. Each window opened with its own particular stiffness, its own way of needing to be coaxed up by the brass handle along the bottom rail. Each window had a story. Each window held the years. The doors of such a house had their own sounds. The front door, heavy with a screen door in front of it during the warm months, a screen door that closed with that particular slow whoosh and final small slap that is the sound of summer afternoons in America. The kitchen door to the backyard, lighter, more often used, the hinges oiled regularly so as not to creak, but always with that one small squeak when the door opened past a certain point that the woman of the house never bothered to fix because it was a familiar sound, a friendly sound, a sound that meant she was coming or going from her own home. The bedroom doors that closed gently because the children might be sleeping, or because the husband had to be up early for work, or simply because the woman of the house had a habit of moving softly through her own rooms, never wanting to disturb anything, never wanting to be louder than she needed to be. And the small details, the ones that made each house its own. The brass coat hooks by the front door holding a wool jacket and a wide-brimmed hat and an umbrella with a polished wooden handle. The umbrella stand made from an old milk can painted dark green. The boot scraper outside the kitchen door where everyone scraped the mud or the snow off their shoes before coming in. The mat just inside the door, where the boots were taken off and lined up in neat rows, smallest to largest. The hat rack at the foot of the stairs, where the husband's work hat lived during the evenings, hanging on its wooden peg, soft and shaped by the years. These small things, these small specific things, these were the texture of a home in those years. Not luxurious, not modern, not impressive in any way, only thoroughly lived with, thoroughly cared for, thoroughly known. The house, finally, was a kind of slow song the woman composed every day, by her sweeping, by her cooking, by her dusting and her airing and her mending and her arranging. The notes were small and the rhythm was patient. The melody was made of repetition, the same tasks done in the same order, on the same days, year after year. Monday for laundry, Tuesday for ironing, Wednesday for the heavy cleaning, Thursday for the marketing, Friday for the baking, Saturday for the deep work, the floors and the windows and the polishing of the silver, and the careful preparation for Sunday's slower pace. Sunday for church and for the long midday meal, and then for sitting in the parlour with the radio on softly, and a book in her lap and her shoes off and the children playing somewhere outside, calling to each other across the yards. This was the home. This was the small, steady world she made and kept. And as we move further into this story, we'll move with her, slowly, gently, through the days and seasons of that world, never hurried, never strained, only listening, only watching, only letting the soft long song of an ordinary life wash over us until our own tired thoughts begin to quiet and the present moment begins to blur into the soft grey hush of sleep. She rose before the rest of the house. That was the first rule, before her husband, before the children, before the dog scratching at the kitchen door. The morning belonged to her in a way that no other hour did, and she had learned over the years to value it, to almost protect it, to slip into the dim quiet of the pre-dawn kitchen the way someone slips into a familiar coat. The clock on her bedside table rang at 5:15, a small wind-up alarm with a brass bell and 2 metal hammers. She reached for it before it could finish its first ring, silenced it with a gentle tap, and lay still for a moment in the warm darkness listening. Beside her, her husband's breathing was deep and steady. In the next room, the children had not stirred. The house was holding its breath, the way a house holds its breath in the last hour before it wakes. She sat up slowly. The bed creaked a little under the shift of her weight, and she paused, and then continued, lifting the blankets aside and putting her feet down on the rag rug she kept beside the bed for exactly this purpose, so that her bare feet would not have to touch the cold wood floor first thing in the morning. She slipped on her housecoat, the cotton one with the small blue flowers, the one she wore every morning until she had time to dress properly. She pinned her hair back loosely with a few bobby pins she kept on the dresser, and then she went down the stairs. The stairs creaked in 2 places, as they always did, but she knew where to step and where not to step, and she came down silently, her hand trailing along the smooth banister, the wood warm under her palm even at this hour. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused for a moment, listening again. Nothing stirred. Good. She had her morning to herself. The first task was the stove. In a coal stove kitchen, this was the foundation of everything else. She moved to the stove, opened the small door at the bottom, and looked in at the bed of ash and the few small live coals still glowing red in the deep grey. She raked the ashes gently, exposing the embers, and laid in a small handful of kindling, a few thin pieces of dry pine she kept stacked in a wooden crate beside the stove. The kindling caught in a moment, snapping and curling. She added a few larger pieces, then closed the door and opened the dampers, and the stove began to draw, the air moving up through the firebox, the heat beginning to build. She filled the kettle from the tap and set it on the back of the stove, where it would slowly come to a boil over the next 20 minutes. She measured coffee into the basket of the percolator, 2 careful spoonfuls, no more, because coffee was rationed and precious. She set the percolator on the front of the stove, and now she had 3 things working: the fire building, the kettle warming, the coffee waiting. She turned to the radio, a small wooden cabinet model that sat on a shelf near the door to the parlour, and turned it on, the dial glowing faintly amber as the tubes warmed up. She turned the volume low just enough to hear, and tuned to the station she always listened to in the morning, the one that played soft music and gave the news every 15 minutes. A man was reading the weather, partly cloudy, mild, with rain expected by evening. She nodded to herself. Good. The garden could use it. She moved through her kitchen now with a kind of practiced grace, doing 5 things at once and somehow doing each of them well. She set out the cast iron skillet and put it on the stove to warm. She got down the bowl and the eggs from the refrigerator. She got down the flour and the bowl of starter for the pancakes. She had a routine, a ritual really, of always making something hot for her husband's breakfast, even on the mornings when she did not feel like eating anything herself. He worked hard. He needed to start the day with something solid. That was simply how it was, and she did not question it, the way she did not question the rising of the sun or the falling of the rain. While the coffee perked and the skillet heated, she opened the kitchen door and stepped out onto the small back porch. The air was cool and damp. The grass in the yard glistened with dew. The robin who had been testing his voice earlier was now in full song, perched on the top of the clothesline post, throwing his small bright melody into the grey morning. She breathed in deeply, smelling the cold ground and the new spring leaves, and the faint smoke from a neighbour's chimney 3 houses down, where someone else was also up early, also making coffee, also stepping out onto a back porch to greet the morning. She felt in those moments the comforting awareness of being one of many, of being part of a great quiet network of women all rising before their houses, all setting their kitchens in order, all beginning the long, careful day. She came back inside and shut the door softly. The kettle was beginning to sing. She poured hot water into the teapot to warm it, then poured the water out and put in 3 spoonfuls of tea leaves, and poured fresh boiling water over them and set the lid back on. The tea would steep for exactly 4 minutes, and then she would have a cup to herself before anyone else came down. This was the small reward she gave herself every morning. 4 minutes, sometimes 5, of standing at the kitchen window with a hot cup of tea in her hand, looking out at the garden, watching the light change. The light was changing now. The pale grey of pre-dawn was warming to a soft pink along the eastern edge of the sky. The robin had been joined by a wren and a few sparrows, and the chorus was beginning to gather. Somewhere far off she could hear the sound of a freight train, the long low whistle that always came through town around 6 in the morning. The streetlight on the corner went out, the way it always did, exactly when the sun crossed some invisible threshold. The day was beginning. She drank her tea slowly in small sips, holding the cup with both hands. She thought about the day ahead, but not with anxiety, only in a quiet, planning way. She thought about what needed to be done. The marketing today. A letter to write to her sister in Ohio. The hem of her daughter's dress to be let down. The squash to be put on for soup. The bread dough that was rising in a covered bowl on top of the icebox and would need to be punched down in another hour. She did not write any of this down. She did not need to. The list lived in her, organised by some quiet inner scheduler that had been refined over years of practice. When her tea was finished, she rinsed the cup and set it in the dish drainer, and she began to make breakfast in earnest. She broke 6 eggs into a bowl and beat them with a small whisk, adding a little salt and a little pepper and a splash of milk. She heated bacon grease in the cast-iron skillet, the grease that she saved in a tin can on the back of the stove, the precious cooking fat that was rationed and reused and treasured. She poured the eggs into the skillet, and they began to set immediately, the edges turning white and then golden. She stirred them gently, slowly, with a wooden spoon, the way her own mother had taught her, lifting them off the bottom in soft folds, never letting them brown, never letting them dry. While the eggs cooked, She ladled pancake batter onto the griddle, 3 round pale pools that hissed and bubbled and slowly began to form into perfect pancakes. She watched them carefully, looking for the small bubbles to rise to the surface and pop, and when the moment was right, she flipped each one with a quick, sure motion of her wrist, and they showed their golden brown bottoms, and she smiled a small private smile of satisfaction. There was a real pleasure in cooking well, in cooking the same things you had cooked 1,000 times before and still cooking them well, still bringing them out of the pan at exactly the right moment, still serving them at exactly the right warmth. It was the kind of pleasure that did not announce itself, but it was real. By the time the food was ready, her husband was coming down the stairs. She heard his footsteps overhead, then on the staircase, and she had everything timed to within a minute. The coffee was ready, the eggs were on a warm plate, the pancakes were stacked and covered with a clean dish towel, the butter was softening on a small dish, the maple syrup, what little of it they had, was warming in a small pan of water on the back of the stove. He came into the kitchen in his work clothes, his hair still damp from the basin, smelling faintly of soap and shaving cream. He kissed the top of her head, the way he always did, and she smiled without looking up, the way she always did. He sat down at the kitchen table and she poured his coffee and set the food in front of him, and he ate quietly while she stood at the stove and made her own small breakfast, 2 pieces of toast with a little butter and a small bowl of stewed prunes and her second cup of tea. They did not talk much over breakfast. They never had. It was not a sign of distance. It was the comfortable, companionable silence of 2 people who had been married long enough to know each other's mornings, to know that her husband liked the quiet at this hour, that she did too, that the day would be full of words later, but the morning could just be the morning. The radio played softly, the sound of her husband's fork on the plate, the sound of her own slow breath, the sound of the wind moving through the elm tree in the yard. These were the only sounds, and they were enough. When her husband had finished, he stood up and put on his jacket and his hat. He kissed her cheek at the door. He picked up his lunchbox, the metal one she had packed the night before, with a sandwich and an apple, and a slice of pie wrapped in wax paper, and he went out to the truck or the streetcar or the long walk to the factory, and the screen door whispered close behind him. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go. He turned at the gate and waved. She waved back. And then he was gone, down the street, into the wider world, and she was alone again in the kitchen with the slowly clearing table, and the long quiet day stretching ahead of her like a clean piece of cloth waiting to be sewn. She poured herself another cup of coffee, finally, the one she allowed herself only after he had gone, and she sat down at the kitchen table for a moment of stillness before she began the next stretch of the day. The children would be waking soon. The bread would need attention. The laundry would need to be sorted. But for these few minutes she sat at her own table, in her own kitchen, in her own quiet house, and let the warmth of the coffee fill her hands, and the warmth of the early sun fill the window, and the slow, steady comfort of her own well-kept world fill her chest like a long, deep breath. There was a particular pleasure in those minutes, a pleasure that the world did not name, that no one wrote about, that she did not even quite know how to describe to herself. The pleasure of being the keeper of a house, the pleasure of being the person who knew where everything was, the pleasure of being needed but also of being trusted to know what to do, of being the one who held the small private kingdom of the home together by her own quiet competence. Some of her friends complained about housework. Some of them dreamed of jobs in the city, of nursing or teaching or working in offices. She did not begrudge them their dreams, but for herself, in this kitchen, in this hour, she could not imagine wanting to be anywhere else. She finished her coffee. She stood up. She tied her apron over her housecoat and she began to wash the breakfast dishes in the deep enamelled sink with hot water from the kettle and a little bar of soap and a soft cotton dishcloth. The water was hot. The dishes were clean. The day was beginning. And somewhere in the upstairs bedroom she could hear the first small sounds of a child stirring, turning over in bed, beginning the slow surfacing into morning. She smiled, she rinsed the last cup, she dried her hands on her apron, and she went to the bottom of the stairs and called up softly, in the gentlest voice she had, the voice she used only in the morning, only for waking children, the voice that she had learned from her own mother and that her own daughter would one day learn from her. "Time to get up, sweetheart. Breakfast is ready." The children came down one at a time, the way they always did. The older ones first, more or less dressed. the younger ones in their pyjamas with their hair sticking up in every direction. She kissed each of them on the top of the head as they came into the kitchen and pointed each of them toward the table. She poured milk, she buttered toast. She set out small bowls of oatmeal sweetened with a little brown sugar and a few raisins. She listened to the small morning chatter of children, the soft complaints, the small jokes, the questions about what was happening today and whether they could go to the pond after school, and whether the rain would come before they got home. She answered patiently. She nodded. She smiled without looking up from the stove. She moved through the small storm of breakfast the way a calm woman moves through any weather, with a steady hand and an unhurried voice and a deep underlying confidence that everything would work out, that the eggs would not burn, that the milk would not spill, that the children would eat what they needed to eat and put on their shoes and gather their books and walk out the door at the right hour, the way they did every morning, the way they had always done, the way they would continue to do until they were grown. By the time they were gone, off down the sidewalk in their plaid coats and their carefully pressed clothes, with their lunch pails swinging at their sides and their shoes laced and their hair combed, the kitchen felt very quiet again. She stood at the door and watched them all the way to the corner. The youngest one looked back and waved. She waved back. And then they turned the corner and were gone, and she closed the door, and she stood for a moment with her back against it, and she let out a long, slow breath, and she smiled. The morning was done. The morning had been a small symphony performed beautifully by an audience of one, and now the day belonged to her again. The long middle stretch of it, the working hours, the slow, careful hours, the hours when she would do everything else that needed to be done. She turned back into the kitchen. She rolled up the sleeves of her housecoat. She filled the sink with fresh hot water, and she began. The art of feeding a family in those years was an art of careful arithmetic, performed quietly, 3 times a day, every day with rationed sugar and rationed butter and rationed coffee, and meat that had to be stretched, and bones that had to be saved for soup, and vegetables that had to come from the garden whenever possible, because what came from the garden did not need ration stamps, and did not cost money, and did not require a trip to the store on a day when she did not have time for the store. Ration books arrived every few months from the local board, a small booklet of pages with stamps printed on them in little squares, each stamp a different colour and a different number, each one redeemable for a particular thing. Red stamps for meat and butter and cheese, blue stamps for canned goods, stamps for sugar, for coffee, for shoes, for gasoline. The stamps were precious. The stamps were counted and recounted and planned around. The woman of the house kept the ration book in a small wooden box on top of the icebox beside a pair of scissors, and every week she would sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper and plan the meals for the week, according to what stamps she had and what the family needed, and what she could supplement from the pantry and the garden. Sugar was the hardest, 8 ounces a week per person, sometimes less. She had grown up with sugar being a casual thing, scattered freely on cereal, baked into cookies and pies whenever the mood struck. Now sugar was rationed, and she had to think about it carefully, decide whether the children needed cookies this week or whether the rhubarb pie was a better use of it, calculate whether she could stretch the last cup in the canister to Sunday, or whether she had to send a child next door to ask for a cup borrowed against next month's stamps. Her neighbours were generous about this. Everyone was. The whole street was running the same calculations, and there was a quiet system of borrowing and lending that worked because every woman knew every other woman would do the same for her if needed. Butter was rationed too, and was often replaced by margarine, which in those years came as a white block of vegetable fat with a small packet of yellow food colouring that you mixed in yourself by squeezing the bag and kneading the colour through the white, until it looked at least somewhat like butter. The children sometimes helped with this, taking turns squeezing the bag, watching the white turn slowly to gold, considering it a small kitchen game. The result was not really butter, and never quite tasted like butter, but it was what they had, and you put it on bread and you used it for cooking, and you did not complain because there were soldiers overseas who did not have any butter at all, and that put a small thing like margarine in its proper perspective. Meat was the most complicated of all. A roast was a special occasion, planned around for weeks. A whole chicken on Sunday was a luxury, and the woman of the house knew how to get 4 meals out of 1 chicken, the way her grandmother had known. The Sunday dinner was the chicken roasted whole, with potatoes and carrots in the pan and a small pitcher of gravy made from the drippings. The Monday lunch was chicken sandwiches, with the meat picked carefully off the bones and chopped fine and mixed with a little mayonnaise and a little pickle, and spread on slices of homemade bread. The Tuesday dinner was chicken pot pie, with the last of the meat and whatever vegetables were on hand, and a flaky crust on top baked golden brown. And the Wednesday lunch was chicken soup, made by simmering the bones all morning with an onion and a carrot and a stalk of celery, and then straining the broth and adding noodles and bits of meat and a handful of peas. 4 meals, 1 chicken, nothing wasted, nothing thrown out. Even the fat from the broth skimmed off the top was saved in a jar to be used for cooking later in the week. Beef was rarer still. When she could get a small piece of beef, she would often grind it herself in the metal grinder she clamped to the edge of the kitchen table, and she would stretch it with breadcrumbs and a beaten egg and grated onion to make a meatloaf that fed the whole family with leftovers for sandwiches the next day. Or she would cut it into small pieces and make a stew, simmered slowly all afternoon with potatoes and turnips and carrots and a few tablespoons of flour to thicken the broth served over biscuits or noodles or rice. The trick was always to make the meat go further, to let the vegetables and the starches do the heavy lifting of filling stomachs, to use the meat as flavour more than as substance. Fish was easier in some places. If you lived near a coast or a lake or a river, fish was not rationed, and a Friday meal of fried fish or fish chowder was a regular event. In the inland towns, the fish came in cans mostly, tuna and salmon and sometimes sardines, and the woman of the house learned to make casseroles and salads and sandwiches that turned a single can of tuna into a meal for a family of 6. Tuna noodle casserole with cream of mushroom soup and crushed potato chips on top. Salmon patties mixed with breadcrumbs and onion and pan-fried in a little oil. Sardines on toast with mustard, which the children either loved or hated, and which she served on the days when nothing else seemed possible. Eggs were a kind of currency in their own right. If you kept chickens, you had eggs in abundance, at least in the warm months when the hens were laying. Eggs became the answer to 100 questions. What is for breakfast? What is for lunch on a Saturday? What can I put in this batter to stretch it? What do I have for the children if I have nothing else? Eggs scrambled, eggs fried, eggs poached on toast, eggs hard-boiled and sliced for sandwiches, eggs beaten into custards and puddings and into the pancake batter at breakfast. The chickens out in the yard were a small daily miracle. 6 brown hens that pecked and clucked and laid 1 egg each per day, more or less, and that meant 6 eggs to be gathered every afternoon, washed gently and placed in the wire egg basket in the pantry. Bread was made at home, almost always. Bakery bread was available, but it cost more than flour and yeast, and the woman of the house considered baking her own bread to be one of the basic competencies of running a household. She kept a sourdough starter in a covered jar in the icebox, fed every few days with a little flour and a little water, alive and bubbling and faintly sour. She made bread twice a week, on Mondays and Thursdays, 2 large loaves at a time, kneaded by hand on the kitchen table set to rise in a covered bowl on top of the icebox where the warmth from the motor kept it gently warm, punched down and shaped and set to rise again, finally baked in the oven until the kitchen filled with the smell that everyone in the family loved best. The smell of a house where someone was making bread. Vegetables came mostly from the garden in the warm months and from the pantry in the cold ones. In the summer, every meal had something fresh on the table. Sliced tomatoes still warm from the vine, sprinkled with salt. Green beans steamed and tossed with a little butter. Sweet corn boiled and dripping. Cucumbers sliced thin and soaked in vinegar with a little sugar and a little salt. Lettuce from the cold frame, washed in the deep sink and dried in a clean cloth and torn into a wooden bowl with sliced radishes and a few green onions. The salads were simple, but the vegetables were perfect, picked the same morning, eaten the same evening, with the dirt of the garden still faintly on her hands when she sat down to eat. In the winter the vegetables came from the jars in the pantry. Stewed tomatoes warmed in a small pot and served alongside biscuits and gravy. Green beans baked into a casserole with cream of mushroom soup and crispy fried onions on top. Beets cold from the jar, sliced and drizzled with a little vinegar. Sauerkraut made in the autumn from heads of cabbage shredded and salted and fermented in a stoneware crock down in the cellar, served alongside pork or sausages, or simply on its own with a slice of dark bread. Pickled peaches, a particular favourite, cinnamon-scented and sweet and tart all at once. A small bright taste of summer in the middle of February. Soups were a backbone of the cold months. A pot of soup on the stove, simmering slowly all day, was the easiest way to feed a family on very little. A ham bone, a few potatoes, a chopped onion, a handful of dried beans soaked overnight, some carrots and celery from the cellar, a sprig of dried thyme from the bunch hanging upside down by the back door, a couple of bay leaves, salt and pepper, water. That was a meal that fed 6 people for $1, maybe less, and that warmed the house all afternoon, and that filled the kitchen with a smell that drew everyone home from school and from work, hungry, eager, glad to sit down at a warm table with a deep bowl in front of them. She made her own broth too. Whenever she had the bones of a chicken or a turkey or a piece of beef, she put them in a pot with water and an onion, and the small ends of vegetables that she saved in a paper bag in the icebox, the carrot tops and celery leaves and onion skins that other cooks threw out. She simmered the broth for hours, sometimes all day, and then she strained it through a sieve and put it in mason jars and stored it in the pantry or the icebox, and she used it for soups and for cooking rice and for moistening leftover meat when she warmed it up. Nothing in her kitchen was wasted. Nothing. Desserts were simple, often but always present. A pie at the end of a Sunday dinner, a cake on a birthday, cookies in a tin on the kitchen counter, replenished every few days, oatmeal cookies with raisins or molasses cookies that kept for a long time, and softened beautifully if you put a slice of bread in the tin with them. Bread pudding made from stale bread and a little milk and a little sugar and a beaten egg, baked golden in the oven and served warm with a spoonful of cream. Applesauce made from windfalls in the autumn, cooked down with a little cinnamon and a little sugar, and stored in jars to be opened all winter long. Rice pudding, slow cooked in a low oven for 2 hours, with raisins and a sprinkle of nutmeg on top, creamy and comforting on a cold evening. She made pies often, as much for her own pleasure as for the family's. There was something deeply satisfying about a pie. The cool dough on the marble slab, the careful rolling out, the lifting of the crust into the pan, the crimping of the edges with the side of her thumb, the fluting just so, the filling poured in, fragrant, glistening, the top crust laid over, the edges sealed, the small cuts in the surface to let the steam escape, the egg wash brushed across the top with a small soft brush, the sprinkle of sugar that glittered on the gold crust as it baked. She made apple pies, peach pies, blueberry pies, cherry pies in the late summer, pumpkin pies in the autumn, mince pies at Christmas, lemon meringue pies for special occasions when she had managed to save enough sugar. Each pie was a small monument. Each pie was an announcement that the family was loved and well kept. The art of feeding a family in those years was finally the art of making a great deal out of very little. It was the art of patience, of planning, of using what you had, of letting nothing go to waste. It was the art of knowing how to soak beans overnight so they would cook in less time the next day. It was the art of knowing how to render bacon fat and use it as cooking oil. It was the art of knowing when the bread was ready by the sound it made when you tapped the bottom of the loaf, hollow, perfect. It was the art of knowing what could be substituted for what, of making do, of inventing on the spot when one ingredient was missing and another had to take its place. She was an artist of this kind, though she would never have called herself one. She would have laughed at the suggestion, perhaps, or shaken her head, or simply said that she was only doing what every other woman on the street was doing, what her mother had done, what every wife and every mother had always done. She would have been right, in a way, and she would also have been wrong. Because the doing of it, when it was done well, when it was done with love, when it was done with care and with patience and with the steady accumulating skill of years, was an art. And the food on the table, when she finally sat down to it in the evening, was the proof of that art, even if no one ever said so out loud, even if no one ever wrote it down. She did not need them to. The pleasure of the work was its own reward. The full plates were their own reward. The well-fed children were their own reward. And the small private satisfaction of knowing she had done it again, had pulled another meal out of the carefully managed resources of her pantry and her garden and her stamps, had made something good and warm and nourishing out of very little, was a satisfaction she carried with her always, quietly, beneath her apron, like a small steady light that never quite went out. The garden began in February in her mind, long before it began in the ground. February was the month of seed catalogues, those wonderful thick books full of colour illustrations and small block paragraphs of description that arrived in the mailbox in the dead of winter and were read at the kitchen table over many cups of tea. Burpee, Park, Gurney. The names of the great seed companies were as familiar to her as the names of old friends. She would sit by the window on a cold afternoon, with the radio playing softly and the soup simmering on the stove, and she would mark up the catalogues with a pencil, circling the variety she wanted to try this year, calculating how much she could afford, planning the layout of the garden in her head. The vegetable garden was an expression of long thought. She knew which beds got the morning sun and which got the afternoon shade. She knew where the soil was richest, having added compost to those beds for years, and where it was thin and rocky and better suited to plants that did not need much. She knew which corner the deer occasionally came to, and where she needed to put a fence, and where she needed to plant the marigolds that would keep the rabbits at a respectful distance. She had learned all of this through years of observing, of failing and succeeding, of paying attention. In March, the seed packets arrived. Small paper envelopes with bright illustrations on the front, each one holding the unbelievable promise of an entire summer. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, beans, squash, lettuce, radishes, beets, carrots, onions. Each packet held 100 or more tiny seeds, and each seed held within itself a fully formed plant, dormant, waiting. There was something miraculous about a packet of seeds, something she never quite got used to, even after 20 years of gardening. The smallness of the seed, the largeness of what it would become, the strange patient magic of dormancy. She started some of the seeds indoors on a sunny windowsill or under a small grow light her husband had rigged up in the cellar. Tomato seedlings mostly, a few peppers, a flat of marigolds and zinnias for the flower border. The seedlings came up pale and thin at first, 2 tiny rounded leaves balanced on a slender stem, and then a few days later the first true leaves appeared, jagged and recognizable, and you could see the future plant beginning to assert itself. She watered them carefully with a small spray bottle, and she turned the flats every few days so they would grow straight, and she fed them once a week with a weak solution of liquid fertilizer. In April, when the danger of frost had passed and the soil had warmed, the planting began in earnest. Her husband would turn over the garden beds with a spade on a Saturday afternoon, and she would follow behind him with a hoe, breaking up the larger clumps of soil, raking the surface smooth, marking out the rows with stakes and string. The smell of freshly turned earth was, to her, one of the great smells of the world, dark and rich and full of possibility. She breathed it in deeply every spring, and she thought every year that nothing else smelled quite like it, that nothing else promised so much, that there was no other smell in the world that meant the year was truly beginning. She planted in the order her grandmother had taught her, which was the order most gardeners followed. Peas first, because peas could stand a little frost and wanted to be in the ground while the soil was still cool and damp. Then radishes and lettuce and spinach. The cool weather greens planted directly in the ground from seed and thinned later, when the seedlings had a few true leaves. Then onion sets, small dry brown bulbs pushed gently into the soil with the pointed end up, that would grow all summer and be pulled up in the autumn for storage. Then carrots and beets sown in shallow furrows, covered lightly, watered well. The tomatoes and peppers did not go out until late May, when the nights had warmed and the soil was deeply heated. By then the seedlings she had started indoors were leggy and ready, and she planted them deep, burying the stems halfway up so they would put down extra roots, and she staked each one carefully, and she put a small ring of newspaper around the base to keep the cutworms away, and she watered them in with a long slow drink that soaked all the way down to the roots. The beans went in next, climbing varieties up wooden poles set into peas of 3, or bush varieties in long rows. The cucumbers, trained to climb a fence on the east side of the garden. The summer squash and the winter squash, given plenty of space because they sprawled. The corn, planted in blocks rather than long rows so the wind could pollinate them properly. 4 short rows of 6 plants each rather than 1 long row of 24. By June, the garden was fully planted, and the daily work of tending it had begun. She tended the garden every morning after breakfast before the heat of the day. She walked the rows slowly with a small basket on her arm, looking for what was ready and looking for what was not, looking for weeds to pull and pests to pick off, and small problems to solve before they became large problems. She knew her garden. She knew it the way she knew her kitchen. She could walk through it with her eyes half closed and tell you what was happening in every corner. The corn is putting out its tassels. The first tomatoes are blushing red. The squash blossoms are open. The bean leaves are showing the first faint sign of mildew and need a dusting of powder before the next rain. By July, the harvest had begun in earnest. The first ripe tomato was a small celebration, lifted gently from the vine and brought into the kitchen and sliced thick and served with salt for lunch. The first sweet corn was an even bigger celebration, picked just before the water came to a boil, husked on the back porch, dropped into the boiling water for exactly 5 minutes, served with butter and salt and eaten immediately, the kernels bursting between the teeth, sweet beyond description. The first cucumber, the first green pepper, the first eggplant. Each one was an event. Each one was the proof that the long winter had finally given way to something good. But the harvest was also the beginning of the second great work of the gardening year, which was the preserving, because no family could eat all that a well-tended garden produced in the fullness of summer. The tomatoes came in by the bushel, the beans came in by the basket, the cucumbers came in faster than anyone could keep up with, and so the kitchen turned into a small factory, and the woman of the house spent long, hot afternoons in front of the stove, processing what the garden had given her, putting up the abundance for winter. The canning was an enormous undertaking, repeated week after week from July until October. She kept the canning equipment on a high shelf in the pantry, and brought it down only in summer. The big enamelled water bath canner with its rack inside, the tall pressure canner for vegetables that needed higher heat, the funnel and the jar lifter, and the magnetic lid wand. She washed the mason jars in hot soapy water and set them upside down on a clean cloth to dry. She boiled the lids in a small pan of water to soften the rubber seal. She prepared the food, hot and ready, and she filled the jars with a steady hand, leaving the proper amount of headspace, wiping the rims clean with a damp cloth, screwing on the lids finger-tight. The canner came up to a boil. The jars went in carefully on their wire rack. She set the timer, 20 minutes for tomatoes with a tablespoon of lemon juice in each pint, 40 minutes for green beans in the pressure canner at 10 pounds, 25 minutes for peaches with a light syrup. Each food had its own time, its own technique, its own particular care. She had a notebook in the pantry, with all of this written down in her own handwriting, copied originally from her mother's notebook, and she referred to it every time, even though she knew most of it by heart. The kitchen filled with steam and the strong smells of whatever she was working with. Tomato days were red and acidic, with the smell of cooked tomatoes hanging in the air for hours. Peach days were sweet and warm, with the syrup bubbling and the kitchen smelling like a bakery. Bean days were green and earthy. Pickle days were sharp with vinegar and dill. Each day had its own atmosphere, and each day ended with a row of jars cooling on a clean cloth on the kitchen counter, the lid slowly pulling down with that satisfying small ping that meant the seal had taken. The food was preserved. The jar would keep for a year. She wiped each jar with a damp cloth when it was cool, and she labelled it with a small piece of masking tape on which she'd written, in pencil, the contents and the date. Stewed tomatoes, August 1943. Green beans, July 1943. Peach halves, August 1943. Then she carried the jars down to the pantry and arranged them on the shelves, in neat rows, oldest on the right, newest on the left, so that the oldest would be used first. By the end of the canning season, in late October, the pantry was full, hundreds of jars. The shelves bowed slightly under the weight. She would stand in the pantry doorway sometimes with the door open and the small electric bulb shining down on the rows of glass, and she would feel a deep, quiet pride. This was her work. This was her summer turned into something the family could touch. This was the proof, sitting there in the cool, dim air, that she had done what needed to be done. In addition to canning, there was drying and freezing and pickling and root cellaring. Beans dried on screens in the sun, then shelled and stored in jars. Apples sliced thin and dried in a slow oven, then strung on cotton thread and hung in the kitchen, sweet and chewy treats for the children all winter. Onions and garlic braided into long ropes and hung in the cellar. Potatoes laid carefully in wooden crates with a little straw between the layers. Squashes lined up in a row on the cellar shelves, where the cool dry air would keep them sound until February or even March. The herbs from the garden were dried too, hung in small bundles upside down from a rack near the kitchen ceiling. Parsley, thyme, sage, oregano, basil, mint, dill, chives. They dried slowly over a few weeks, and then she would crumble them off the stems into small jars labelled and dated, and they would flavour her cooking through the long cold months. The smell of those drying herbs hanging in the kitchen was one of the smells of late summer, dusty and green and faintly medicinal, like the scent of a meadow folded into the air of a house. Even the flowers from the garden were brought inside in small careful bunches, set into mason jars or small ceramic vases, or sometimes just into a juice glass on the kitchen windowsill. Zinnias in 100 bright colours, marigolds, gold and orange and rust, cosmos, pink and white and lavender, calendulas, dahlias, when she had room for them, sunflowers towering above the corn. The flowers were a luxury and not a necessity, but she always grew them, because a garden without flowers was, in her view, only half a garden. She wanted the bees to come and the butterflies, and she wanted, in some small way, beauty for its own sake, beauty that did not have to feed anyone, beauty that simply was. By November, the garden was being put to bed for the winter. The dried plants were pulled up and added to the compost pile. The ground was covered with a thick layer of leaves and straw, mulch to protect the soil through the cold months. The garden tools were cleaned and oiled and stored in the shed. The seed packets that had not all been used were stored in a tin in the pantry for next year, though she would mostly buy fresh seeds in February. The garden lay quiet, brown, and waiting. And in the pantry, the year's harvest waited too, in its rows of jars and its braided onions and its bins of potatoes and its bundles of herbs. The pantry was a slow clock measuring out the year. In November the shelves were full, every jar gleaming, every space occupied. By February the shelves had begun to thin a little, with empty spaces where the early peaches and the first tomatoes had been. By April there were larger gaps and only the toughest vegetables remained, the canned greens that no one really liked, the jars of beets that had been pushed to the back. By June, when the garden was beginning to produce again, the pantry was almost empty, only a few jars left, and these would be eaten quickly to make room for the new harvest. This was the rhythm of the year. This was the slow, great cycle of the garden and the pantry. Plant, tend, harvest, preserve, eat, and then plant again. And every year the cycle repeated, and every year she did her part of it, and every year the family was fed, even when the rationing was tightest, even when the budget was leanest, even when the world outside the kitchen was full of news that frightened her in ways she did not always like to admit. The garden and the pantry were her insurance. They were her bulwark against scarcity. They were her quiet declaration that no matter what happened in the wider world, no matter what the news said, no matter how tight the rations grew, her family would eat, and they would eat well. The jars in the pantry were her promise to her children. The seeds in the tin were her promise to the next year. And the soil in the garden, dark and patient and waiting under its blanket of leaves, was her promise to herself that there would be another spring and another summer and another long, warm afternoon of standing in the rows with a basket on her arm and the sun on her shoulders and the simple, deep satisfaction of being a woman who knew how to grow her own food and how to keep it and how to give it to the people she loved. She did not live alone. No one did in those neighbourhoods. The houses were close, the fences were low, and the women who kept the houses knew each other, often for decades, in the deep particular way that women come to know each other when they share a street and share their lives. The neighbourhood was a kind of extended family in itself. There was the woman next door who had been a young bride at about the same time she had been, and who had watched her own children grow up alongside the children next door, and who borrowed sugar and lent eggs and sat on the porch in the summer evenings drinking lemonade. There was the older woman 3 houses down, a widow now, whose husband had died of a heart attack in the spring of 1941, and who lived alone with her cat and her sewing and her quiet routines, and who was watched over gently by all the other women on the street, who took turns bringing her a plate of supper, or stopping by to see if she needed anything from the store. There was the young mother on the corner, just married, with a baby on her hip, and the wide-eyed, slightly overwhelmed look of a woman who had not yet quite figured out how to do all of this, who came over often in those first months for advice and for company, and for the simple comfort of sitting in someone else's kitchen and being told that yes, of course it was hard, and yes, you would figure it out, and yes, the baby would sleep through the night eventually, even though right now it felt like he never would. There was the woman across the street who had a son in the Navy, whose husband worked at the same factory as her own husband, and whose laundry came down on the same day as her own, and hung in the backyard in long parallel lines that the women would wave at each other through sometimes, when they were both pinning sheets to the line at the same time on a Monday morning. The relationships among the women of the street were not formal, they were not announced. They were built out of small daily exchanges, 10,000 of them, stretched over years. A loaf of bread carried over still warm from the oven, a bag of cucumbers from the garden, too many for one family, brought to the porch next door, a coat lent on a cold morning, a pot of soup taken to the house where someone was sick. A child watched for an hour while the mother went to the doctor, a long conversation on the front porch in the early evening while the men were not yet home from work and the children were playing in the yard, about a recipe, about a worry, about a bit of news from the radio, about nothing in particular at all. The neighbourhood had its own communication system, faster than the telephone and more reliable than the newspaper. Word travelled house to house along the back fences. Mrs. Jensen has come down with a cold. Mrs. Murphy got a letter from her son this morning. He's fine. He's in England now. Mrs. Albrecht's daughter is engaged to a young man from Pittsburgh. Mrs. Castellano's husband got a promotion at the plant. The news moved along the street the way water moves through a network of small streams, gathering, branching, finding its way into every kitchen by the end of the day. The women had certain shared spaces where they gathered more formally. The grocery store, of course, where they ran into each other in the produce aisle or at the meat counter, and stopped to talk for a few minutes, comparing notes on what was available this week, what was rationed, what the prices were like. The post office, where they collected their mail and stood in line for stamps and small parcels. The bank, where they made the small weekly deposits to the savings account or cashed a small cheque. The drugstore on the corner, with its soda fountain and its display of magazines and its long counter, where you could sit and have a cup of coffee and exchange a few words with the pharmacist's wife while you waited for a prescription to be filled. Church was the great gathering on Sundays, of course. Whatever denomination, whatever specific congregation, the rhythm was similar across the country. The walk to church on a Sunday morning, dressed in the family's best clothes, the woman of the house in her one good dress and her best hat, the husband in his suit and his felt fedora, the children in scrubbed shoes and combed hair, the greeting on the church steps, a word with the minister, a word with the friends from the choir or the women's auxiliary, the slow procession into the sanctuary, the singing of hymns from the worn hymnals, the rustling of pages, the small whisper of children who had grown bored, the sermon, which the woman half listened to and half thought about other things during, planning her Sunday dinner, or worrying about her daughter's slight fever, or remembering that she needed to write a letter to her aunt this week. After the service, there was always a long lingering on the church steps and on the lawn. The women would gather in small clusters to talk, while the men talked among themselves a little ways off, and the children ran around in the grass and chased each other in their good clothes, and the minister moved through the crowd shaking hands and remembering people's names and small details of their lives. Sometimes there was a coffee hour in the church basement, with a long table set with thermoses of coffee and trays of cookies that the women had taken turns bringing week by week. Sometimes there were notices, a wedding announcement, a death, a soldier coming home on leave, a soldier being deployed. The church was the centre of the community in many small towns and city neighbourhoods. It was the place where life events were marked, babies baptised, couples married, the dead buried. It was the place where the holidays were celebrated with the particular mix of solemnity and festivity that gave each year its shape. Christmas Eve services with candles and carols, Easter morning with lilies and the great hymns of resurrection. The harvest festival in the autumn, with squashes and pumpkins arranged on the altar, and a special offering for the poor of the town. But the women had their own informal church too, their own quiet network of mutual care that operated outside the formal institutions. When someone on the street was sick, the women organised a chain of meal deliveries without any official body deciding it. The word would go out, and one woman would bring a casserole on Tuesday, and another would bring a soup on Wednesday, and another would bring a pie on Thursday. The sick family did not have to ask. The food simply arrived, on the back porch, in covered dishes, with small handwritten notes attached, Get well soon. Thinking of you. Don't worry about returning the dish. Take your time. When a baby was born, the same network swung into action. A bassinet brought from someone's attic. A box of hand-me-down baby clothes from the woman down the street whose own children were now teenagers. A casserole, of course, always a casserole, because the new mother would not have time to cook for weeks. A visit, brief, gentle, just to hold the baby and admire him, and tell the new mother she was doing beautifully. A bouquet of flowers from someone's garden. A small knitted blanket, white or pale yellow, that someone had been working on for months in anticipation. When someone died, the network operated with the same quiet competence. Casseroles again, in greater number now, and pies and cakes and full meals dropped off at the door. Help with the practical matters. Someone to sit with the family in the days before the funeral. Someone to drive to the train station to pick up the relatives coming from out of town. Someone to clean the house in preparation for the post-funeral gathering. Someone to write the thank you notes for the bereaved widow whose hands were shaking too much to write them herself. The friendships among the women were deep, often, in ways the women themselves did not always articulate. They saw each other almost every day. They shared their lives in the small daily details that no one else got to see. They knew each other's husbands and children. They knew each other's worries. They knew each other's small private heartbreaks, the miscarriage that had not been mentioned at the time, the difficulty with a teenage son, the sister who had moved away and never wrote, the small chronic illnesses, the small chronic disappointments, the things that would never be said in mixed company, but that lived between two women who had been friends for 20 years and who could speak to each other in a kind of shorthand that left half the words unsaid. In the summer, the women sat on each other's porches in the long evenings after dinner, while the men listened to baseball on the radio in the parlour and the children chased fireflies in the yard. They drank iced tea or lemonade, and they talked about everything and nothing. They laughed, often. The laughter of women who had known each other for a long time was a particular kind of laughter, easy, comfortable, knowing. They could laugh at things they had laughed at 100 times before, and the laughter was just as good as the first time. They could repeat the small running jokes that had grown up between them over the years. They could tell each other stories that they had told each other 10 times already, and no one ever stopped them or said they had heard it before, because the telling was the point. The telling was a kind of music, and the music was meant to be played again and again. In the winter, when the porches were no good for sitting, the women visited each other in their kitchens. They would walk down the street wrapped in heavy coats, sometimes with a covered dish or a small offering tucked under one arm, and they would knock on a kitchen door and they would be welcomed in, and they would sit at the kitchen table for an hour or two, drinking coffee, talking, while a soup simmered on the stove and the radio played softly and the snow fell outside the window. These winter visits had their own particular feeling. Slower than the summer porch visits, more indoors, more private, more confidential. The conversations went deeper sometimes, in the kitchens of winter than they did on the porches of summer. There were certain women on the street who functioned as anchors for everyone else. The one who had been there longest, who knew the history of every house, who could tell you who had built it and when, who had lived in it before, what had happened in it over the years. The one who was the best cook, whose recipes were copied and shared and adapted by every other woman on the block. The one who was the best with children, whose own had turned out beautifully, and whose advice on raising children was sought by every younger mother. The one who had a kind of native wisdom, who could be relied on to say the right thing at the right time, who had a steady judgment and a quiet authority that made people listen when she spoke. The woman of the house we have been following had her own role in this network. She was, perhaps, the one who could be counted on, the one who would bring a casserole when a casserole was needed, who would watch a child when a child needed watching, who would sit with a friend in a dark hour without trying to fix anything, only being there. She had earned her place on the street through years of quiet reliability. She was not the loudest woman on the block, and she was not the most striking, and she was not the one whose stories everyone repeated. But she was the one whose name came up when something needed to be done, and she was the one whose absence would have been most deeply felt if she had moved away. The neighbourhood was, finally, a small society of women, working in concert, each one tending her own house and her own family, and at the same time tending in subtle ways the larger life of the street. They did not call this work. They did not think of it as work. They simply lived this way because it was the way their mothers had lived, and the way their grandmothers had lived, and the way their great-grandmothers had lived back through generations of small towns and small villages and small farms scattered across continents. The work of women in community, the slow, patient weaving of a social fabric out of small daily threads. It did not show in the newspapers, it did not show in the history books, it only showed in the lived texture of the days, in the casseroles arriving on porches, in the babies being held, in the long evening conversations on the steps, in the quiet, steady knowledge that no one on this street was alone. And so, when the war came, and when the news from overseas became harder, and when the Silver Star banners began appearing in the windows of houses up and down the street, the network was already there, already in place, already strong. The women did not have to invent a way to support each other. They only had to keep doing what they had always been doing, more carefully, more attentively, with a little more love and a little more patience. The casseroles continued, the visits continued, the long evening conversations on the porches continued, and the women held each other, in their unannounced, unsung way, through whatever the years brought. The war was always there, even when it was not mentioned. It was there in the radio that played softly in the kitchen all day, with its hourly news bulletins. It was there in the newspaper that came every morning, with its maps of distant battlefields and its lists of casualties from the local towns. It was there in the small flag in the front window of the house, with its single blue star, indicating that the family had a son in the service. It was there in every conversation, in every prayer at the dinner table, in every silence that fell when a particular boy's name was mentioned. It was there in the texture of every day. And yet, for the woman of the house, the war was also far away. She did not see the battles, she did not hear the guns, she did not know, in the way the soldiers themselves knew, what was happening across the ocean. The war reached her in slower forms, in letters mostly, in the radio, in rumours, in the stamps on the ration book that meant another small thing she could not have, in the absence of the men who had gone, in the empty chairs at the dinner tables along her street, in the quietness of certain houses that had once been louder. The letters were everything. Letters from her brother in the Pacific, letters from her nephew, somewhere in North Africa for a while, and then later in Italy, letters from the son of her best friend on the corner, whose handwriting was small and careful, and whose letters always tried to sound cheerful, even when his mother could read between the lines and see how tired he was. The letters arrived irregularly, sometimes in clusters of 3 or 4 at once, when a backed-up shipment finally made it through, and sometimes not at all for weeks. And the not at all weeks were the hardest, when the woman of the house would walk to the mailbox each morning hoping for a thin envelope with the V-mail printing on it, and would walk back empty-handed, and would tell herself that no news was good news, that the mail was simply slow, that he was fine, he was fine, he was fine. She wrote letters in return every week, sometimes more often. She wrote at the dining room table after the supper dishes were done, with a small writing pad and a fountain pen, and the lamp turned to its brightest setting. She wrote about home. She wrote about the small daily things which she had been told were what the soldiers wanted to hear, the things that reminded them of the world they were fighting to come back to. She wrote about the garden, what was coming up, what the beans were doing this year. She wrote about the neighbours, the small bits of news from the street. She wrote about the children, what they had said, what funny things they had done, what they had learned at school. She wrote about the weather, the storms, the snowfall, the first robins of spring, the first snow of winter. She did not write about the news. She did not write about her fears. She did not write about the difficult days when she could not stop thinking about him, when she would find herself standing in the kitchen with a dish rag in her hand and tears running down her face for no reason she could name, and would have to set down the rag and go upstairs to the bathroom and wash her face in cold water and remind herself that other women were going through the same thing, that her own grandmother had gone through it during the previous war, that this was simply what it was to love someone who had gone away to fight. The letters from him were treasured. Each one was opened with shaking hands. Each one was read 3 times in a row, the first time fast just to know that he was alive and well, the second time slowly to absorb every detail, the third time savouring the small particular phrases he used, the way he closed each letter with the same affectionate sign-off, the way he always asked about specific people back home, the dog, the neighbours, the favourite cousin, the hometown baseball team. Each letter was then refolded carefully and placed in a wooden box in her bedroom, on top of all the others, and the box was nearly full now, dozens of letters from the long months he'd been gone. She read the letters again and again, in the evening sometimes, when the house was quiet and her husband was asleep and the children were tucked into bed. She would take the box down from the closet shelf and open it on her lap, and she would read through the letters in order, watching the progression of his time away, and the changes in his handwriting, and the small clues in his words about where he had been and what he'd been doing. She knew his unit. She knew more or less the broad outlines of his deployment, but the specifics were censored, and so much of what she pieced together was speculation, was hope, was the slow, careful reconstruction of a life lived 1,000 miles away in conditions she could not fully imagine. The radio brought news that was always too general and never specific enough. There had been heavy fighting in such and such a sector. There had been an Allied advance in such and such a region. There had been a counterattack here, a withdrawal there. The voices on the radio were calm and authoritative, but the words they spoke meant very little to the woman trying to figure out whether her brother was safe. She listened anyway. Every hour on the hour she would stop whatever she was doing and listen to the news, and she would scan the words for any sign, any hint, any small detail that might tell her something. And then the news would end, and she would go back to whatever she'd been doing, and she would try not to think about it for the next 50 minutes. The newspaper was harder. The newspaper had the casualty lists. The lists came out every few days, names of the dead and the wounded and the missing, by hometown. She read the list carefully every time, her finger moving down the column of names, looking for any name she might know, any boy from the neighbourhood, any soldier from a family on her street. Sometimes she did find a name. Sometimes she would stop, halfway down the column, and her breath would catch, and she would have to set the paper down for a moment before she could go on. The boy from 3 blocks over. The cousin of someone she knew. The young husband who had been married just before he shipped out, whose wife was still on the street, walking around with the same Blue Star banner in her window. When the Gold Star banners began to appear, replacing the Blue Star ones, the meaning was immediate and devastating. A Blue Star meant a serviceman. A Gold Star meant a serviceman who had died. The first time a Gold Star banner appeared on her street, she did not know whose house it was at first, and she walked the block slowly, looking at each window, and she felt her heart sink as she realized which house it was, and she walked home and sat on her own front porch for a long time, just sitting, not crying, not thinking, just absorbing the news of someone else's loss while feeling the small dark relief of knowing it was not her own. And then she felt guilty for that small dark relief. And then she went inside and gathered up a casserole and a pie and walked back down the street and knocked on the door. And she sat with the mother for an hour, holding her hand, saying very little, because there was nothing to say, only the simple human fact of being there together in the worst hour of someone else's life. The war shaped the daily life of the home in countless practical ways. The rationing was the most obvious, but there were others. The blackout drills in some coastal cities, when every window had to be covered with heavy curtains and every light extinguished, when the woman of the house would sit in the dark living room with her family and listen for the all-clear siren. The scrap drives, which she participated in faithfully, saving every tin can and washing it and flattening it and bringing it to the collection point at the corner of the schoolyard. Saving every bit of bacon grease in a tin and bringing it to the butcher, who collected it for the war effort, for explosives, of all things. Saving every piece of scrap metal, every old pot, every broken tool, every bicycle wheel that had been discarded. The Victory Garden was hers, of course, though she had been growing a garden for years before anyone called it that. The government posters appeared in the windows of the post office and the grocery store, urging women to plant gardens to feed their families and to free up commercial food for the troops. She had always done this. So had her mother, so had her grandmother. But now it was patriotic and she was praised for it. And she was given pamphlets with planting tips and ration calculation tables. She read the pamphlets and put them in a drawer and went on doing what she had always done, which was tending her garden carefully, season by season, in her own quiet, competent way. There were the small, careful adjustments to 1,000 habits. Saving string, saving paper, saving aluminum foil and washing it and reusing it 3 or 4 times. Saving the wax paper from a loaf of bread for wrapping sandwiches the next day. Saving wooden crates for kindling, saving everything that could possibly be saved, because everything was either rationed or in short supply, or simply needed somewhere else for the war effort, and she had absorbed deeply the principle that nothing could be wasted now, not even the smallest thing. There were the war bond drives, when the women of the street would walk together to the bank and put their small, careful savings into bonds that would help fund the war. There were the knitting circles, where the women gathered in someone's living room to knit socks and scarves and balaclavas for the soldiers, working from patterns provided by the Red Cross, using grey and brown and dark green wool, talking quietly, the soft click of knitting needles filling the room while the radio played in the background. There were the bandage rolling parties at the church, where the women rolled bandages by hand for the field hospitals overseas, sitting around long tables working steadily for hours. There were the small celebrations when good news did come, a letter from a son, a telegram saying a soldier was being moved to a safer assignment, a radio bulletin announcing a major Allied advance. The war had its own small joys mixed in with its large sorrows, and the women learned to take the joys when they came, briefly, gratefully, before turning back to the long, patient work of waiting. But mostly the war was waiting. That was the texture of it for the women at home. Long stretches of uncertainty punctuated by occasional definite news. The waiting filled the days like a low constant hum. It was always there. It became part of the air she breathed. She got used to it, the way you get used to anything when there is no choice, but she never stopped feeling it. It lived in a particular place in her chest, just below the breastbone, a small, constant tension that did not go away even when she was doing perfectly ordinary things, even when she was kneading bread or hanging laundry, or reading a story to her youngest child at bedtime. She found her ways of carrying it. She did her work, mostly. The work of the house was its own answer to many things, including worry. When she was scrubbing the floor or canning tomatoes or weeding the garden, she could not quite worry as much because her body was busy, her hands were busy, her attention was given over to the task. She also turned often to small private rituals, a prayer at bedtime every night, for her brother, for her nephew, for the boys on her street, for all the soldiers and sailors and airmen everywhere. A small candle lit on the kitchen windowsill on certain difficult evenings. A walk in the early morning before anyone else was up, when she could think without having to perform her usual cheerful, capable self for the family. The war taught her something about herself that she had not fully known before. She had not known that she could carry so much for so long without breaking. She had not known that she could keep a household running and look after the children and tend the garden and visit the sick and comfort the bereaved and write letters and listen to the radio and keep her head and her heart together through years of fear, every day, without ever quite letting any of it spill over into the daily life of the family. She had not known that she had it in her, but she had it in her, and she did it. Because there was nothing else to do. Because the alternative, falling apart, was not really an alternative, was simply not available, was something other women might do, but not her, not in this house, not while her husband and her children needed her to be steady. And so she was steady, day after day, week after week, month after month. The war went on, and she went on with it, and the kitchen stayed warm, and the table stayed full, and the children grew, and the letters came when they came, and the radio played its hourly news, and she lit her small candle on her kitchen windowsill, and she carried the war the way she carried everything else, quietly, competently, with the deep, slow patience that was her particular gift to the world, even though the world would never see it, even though no one would ever quite know what it had cost her, even though she herself, looking back later, would not always remember the daily small heroism of getting through a war by simply not stopping. Because she had not stopped. None of them had. And that, in the end, was what carried them through. Children moved through the rooms of the house the way water moves through a riverbed. Everywhere, all the time, finding every small space, reshaping the path itself by their constant moving. The woman of the house had 3 of them, and they were the great work of her days, the great joy of her days, and sometimes the great difficulty of her days, all at once, all together, in a way that no one could explain to a young mother before she had become one herself. The oldest was a girl, 12 years old, on the edge of becoming a young woman. She was tall for her age and quiet and serious, with her father's straight dark hair and her grandmother's steady grey eyes. She was a careful child, a thoughtful child, the kind of child who came home from school and went straight to her room to read, and who had to be coaxed out for dinner, and who carried a book with her almost everywhere she went. She was a help around the house, even at 12, drying dishes after supper, watching her younger brother and sister, doing small mending projects with care and skill. The woman of the house looked at her sometimes, in the lamplight after dinner, with her dark head bent over a book, and she felt a small sharp pang of love so deep that she had to look away for a moment, because she knew this child would not be a child for very many more years, and she knew she had to start letting go even now, even when there was still time. The middle child was a boy, 8 years old, all elbows and knees in motion. He could not sit still. He was always running somewhere, always climbing something, always coming home with a torn shirt or a scraped knee or a bloody nose from some collision with the world. He was a sweet boy, fundamentally, with a soft heart underneath the constant motion, and he loved animals, and he was always bringing home stray cats and injured birds and small things he had found in the alley and wanted to keep. The woman of the house was patient with him. She bandaged his knees, she mended his shirts. She let him keep sometimes the small creatures he brought home, if they could reasonably be kept, and she let him learn the hard lesson, when they could not, that some things had to be set free or given to the local farmer who knew what to do with them. The youngest was a girl, 4 years old, with bright blonde curls and a high, clear voice, and a habit of asking questions that her mother could not always answer. Why is the sky blue? Why does the cat purr? Why do we have to eat carrots? Why is the moon sometimes round and sometimes not? Why is Grandma in heaven, and why can we not go and visit her? The questions never ended. The woman of the house answered as best she could, sometimes seriously, sometimes with a little gentle deflection, sometimes with the simple, honest acknowledgement that she did not know, that no one knew, that some things were just the way they were. The work of caring for 3 children was constant. There was the morning work, getting them up and fed and dressed and out the door for school, which we have already seen. There was the afternoon work when they came home, hungry and tired and full of news from the school day, and needed snacks and time outside and supervision while they did their homework. There was the evening work, the supper, the baths, the bedtime stories, the prayers, the tucking in. There was the night work occasionally when one of them had a bad dream and called out, or when the youngest was sick and needed to be sat up with, or when the middle child had a fever and needed cool cloths and aspirin and small sips of ginger ale. The afternoons had their own particular shape. The children came home from school in waves, with the youngest first because she was only in kindergarten and finished early, and the older 2 later. They came in through the back door, dropping their school bags by the steps, calling out to her as they came, hungry. The first thing she did was feed them. A small plate of cookies, perhaps, with a glass of milk, or apples sliced into pieces with a little peanut butter, or buttered bread with a little jam. She sat at the kitchen table with them while they ate and asked about their day. The middle child told stories of small adventures and small grievances. The oldest read at the table, mostly, while she ate. The youngest chattered without pausing for breath, telling everything she'd seen and done since breakfast, in the precise, vivid detail that only a 4-year-old can manage. After the snack, the children scattered. The youngest stayed nearby, in the kitchen or just outside the back door, where her mother could keep an eye on her. The middle child usually disappeared into the yard or up to his room or down the street to find his friends and would not be seen again until dinner. The oldest sat at the dining room table and did her homework, working her way through arithmetic problems and history questions and pages of cursive handwriting practice, while her mother sat in the next room and mended clothes or peeled potatoes or wrote a letter. Bedtime was its own elaborate ritual, repeated every night. Baths first, in order from youngest to oldest, in the small claw-foot tub upstairs. The youngest was bathed by her mother, with much splashing and small games, and a careful scrubbing of small ears and elbows. The middle child bathed himself mostly, but had to be reminded thoroughly to actually wash, not just sit in the water and play. The oldest wanted privacy now and bathed alone with the door closed. The bathroom would fill with steam and the smell of the soap, a plain ivory soap that everyone used. After baths, pyjamas, and brushed teeth and combed hair, then the youngest 2 were tucked into bed, in the room they shared, with the small lamp turned on between their twin beds, and the blankets pulled up to their chins. Their mother sat on the edge of one bed and read to them from whichever book they had been working through that week. The story was always short, never more than 20 minutes, because they were tired. But the reading itself was the thing, the warm, familiar voice of their mother, the small particular way she did the different characters, the predictable cadence of the sentences. The youngest often fell asleep partway through, and the middle child would only manage to stay awake by a heroic effort, and by the end of the chapter both of them were drowsy and ready to be kissed goodnight and have the lamp turned out and the door pulled almost shut, leaving only a small crack of light from the hallway. The oldest was tucked in last, in her own room, with her own small lamp. By 12 she did not really need to be tucked in anymore, but she still wanted her mother to come in for a few minutes at the end of the day, and so her mother did, sitting on the edge of the bed for 10 or 15 minutes talking quietly about whatever the girl wanted to talk about. School things, friend things, the small subtle questions about growing up that were beginning to surface, asked not directly, often, but obliquely, woven into other conversations requiring careful listening to catch. The mother listened carefully. She answered as best she could. She did not push. She let the girl come to her own things in her own time, and she made sure the girl knew with every visit that there was a place to come. The work of raising children was the work of being patient. That was almost all of it in the end. The work of getting them through the day, through the week, through the year, by being patient one more time, by repeating the same small lessons one more time, by saying the same things you had already said 1,000 times before, with the same gentle tone you had used the first time, because they did not learn things all at once. They learned them slowly, in waves, returning to the same lessons over and over until they finally took root. She was patient. Mostly. She lost her patience sometimes, of course. Every mother does. There were afternoons when she snapped at the middle child for some small infraction, and then felt guilty about it for hours afterwards. There were evenings when she sent the youngest to bed early, because she could not bear another question, and then went up to check on her later, and found her asleep, and felt the deep twinge of regret that all mothers know. The regret of having been less than the mother she wished she could be, on a particular day, in a particular moment. She forgave herself slowly. She apologized to the children when she felt she should. She tried again the next day. And mostly she was simply present day after day, year after year, the warm, dependable centre of their lives. They came to her with their scrapes and their fears and their small triumphs. They came to her when they had a bad dream, and when they had a fight with a friend, and when they had something they wanted to show her, a drawing, a found feather, a paper they had brought home from school with a gold star on it. She received each thing gravely. She admired the drawing. She praised the gold star. She held them when they cried. She laughed with them when they were silly. She sang to them sometimes in the late afternoon. Old songs her own mother had sung, songs about birds and rivers and farmers and old loves, songs that did not really mean anything but that filled the kitchen with a small warm music while she stirred the pot on the stove. The children would not remember most of these days. She knew that even as she lived them. The exact days, the exact moments would blur and dissolve in their memories and become only a general feeling, a general atmosphere, a sense of having been loved and looked after when they were small. But the feeling would be real. The feeling would last. And that was, perhaps, the deepest of her gifts to them. Not any specific thing she did or said, but the cumulative weight of 10,000 ordinary days lived with patience and care, building up in them, year by year, into the simple foundational knowledge that they had been wanted, that they had been kept safe, that they had been loved. She thought about this sometimes in the quiet hours after they were all in bed. She would sit at the kitchen table with a final cup of tea and look at the empty chairs and feel the deep, tired ache of a long day and think about what she had given them. It was hard to say. It was not the kind of thing you could measure. But she felt on most nights that it was enough, that she had done what she could, that the children were as well as she could make them, and that tomorrow she would do it all again, the same patient, slow work, the same careful tending, the same long, quiet labour of love that did not pause and did not end and did not announce itself, but that simply went on, day after day, the way the river goes on, the way the seasons go on, the way everything good and necessary in the world goes on, by simply continuing, simply not stopping, simply being there one more morning when the sun came up. The evening began earlier in those years than it does now, without the distractions that would come with later decades, without television, without the long, bright stretch of evening entertainment. The household began to wind down as soon as the supper dishes were cleared. By 7:30 in the autumn, with the early dark already deep, the house had a settled quiet about it. The children in their pyjamas, the husband in his armchair with a newspaper on his lap, the woman of the house sitting nearby with her mending or her knitting or sometimes simply her hands folded. The supper had been a slow one that evening as on most evenings, a pot of beef stew that had been simmering since early afternoon, and a loaf of bread that had been baked that morning, and a small dish of pickled beets from a jar in the pantry, and a salad of late lettuce from the garden tossed with a little vinegar and a little oil. Dessert, when there was dessert, had been a piece of apple pie with a small dab of whipped cream, and the children had taken theirs to eat at the kitchen table while she and her husband had sat in the dining room with their coffee, talking quietly about nothing in particular. The small, comfortable conversation of people who had been married 15 years and who could be content in each other's company without any particular need to fill the silence. After supper, she had washed the dishes while her husband dried, the way they had done every evening for as long as either of them could remember. The water was hot. The plates were stacked. The radio in the next room played a comedy program that they could half hear through the doorway, the recorded laughter of the studio audience drifting in and out as the dishes clinked and the dish rag wiped, and the small companionable rhythm of the work moved them both gently through the half-hour of clean-up. By 8 o'clock the kitchen was clean, the dishes were put away, the floor was swept, and she could finally untie her apron and hang it on its hook behind the kitchen door, signalling to herself that the workday was over. She washed her hands one last time at the kitchen sink, with a little of the lavender soap she kept there for after work, and she dried them on the small linen towel that hung from a hook near the window. Then she stood for a moment at the window and looked out at the backyard. The garden was already in its early autumn quiet, the tomato vines mostly stripped, the bean pole still standing but bare, the squash patch sprawled and faded. The evening sky was that deep pale blue that happens in late October, and a single star had just appeared above the roof of the neighbour's house, and the air was cool, even through the closed window. She went into the parlour. Her husband was already there in his chair by the fireplace, with a small fire built up against the chill, reading the evening paper. He looked up when she came in and gave her a small smile, and went back to his reading. She settled into her own chair on the other side of the fireplace and picked up her knitting. She was working on a sweater for the youngest child, a small navy blue cardigan with white wooden buttons. She had made the same pattern many times. Her hands moved without thought, the needles clicking softly, the wool sliding through her fingers, the small new stitches accumulating one at a time into the slow, steady fabric of the sweater. The fire was a comfort. She had laid it herself before supper, with kindling and small split logs, and now it was burning down to the steady glowing heart of the fire, the part where the flames were low and the embers were deep red, and the heat radiated out into the room in waves. She watched the fire sometimes, between rows of knitting, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes following the small shifts and collapses of the burning logs. There was something about a fire that asked for watching. There was something about a fire that satisfied a deep old part of her, an ancient quiet part, the part that had been gathering at fires for longer than any history could remember. The radio was on softly in the corner of the parlour. A music programme was playing, slow popular tunes from the era, the warm sad voices of the singers, the soft swing of the orchestras, the gentle introductions of the announcer between the songs. She did not pay close attention. The music was atmosphere, was background, was the soft sound of the world being civilized and orderly around her. She hummed along sometimes, almost without realizing it, when a familiar song came on. Her husband, in his chair, would sometimes hum along too. They would not look at each other when they did this. They would just hum along in their separate chairs, with the fire between them, while the music drifted out of the radio and filled the small warm room. The children were in bed by now. The youngest had been put down at 7, after her bath and her story. The middle child had been sent up at 8, complaining slightly but going without too much resistance. The oldest had stayed up a little later, reading on the couch in the parlour until 8:30, when her mother had given her the gentle look that meant it was time, and she had closed her book and kissed her parents good night and gone upstairs. By 9 o'clock the upper floor of the house was quiet, all 3 of them asleep or close to it, and the parlour below was the only room in the house with light and life in it. She and her husband sometimes talked in the evenings, they sometimes did not. There was no obligation either way. They had been married long enough that silence was not awkward, and conversation was not forced. When they did talk, it was usually about small practical things. The car needed new tyres. The roof had a small leak that he should look at on Saturday. Her mother had written and was thinking of coming for a visit at Thanksgiving. The middle child was having trouble with arithmetic at school and might need some extra help. They would discuss these things slowly with long pauses while their hands continued their work, hers with the knitting, his with turning the pages of the paper. Sometimes they talked about the war. Not directly often, indirectly in pieces. He would mention something he had heard at the factory, a rumour about a contract being expanded, a story about someone's son being wounded. She would mention something she had read in the paper or heard from a neighbour. They would not dwell on these things because dwelling did not help, and the news was always partial and uncertain. They would simply pass these small pieces of information back and forth between them, acknowledging that the war was there, that it was part of their world, and then they would let the conversation drift back to other things. The fire burned lower. The light in the parlour grew softer. The room grew slightly cooler at the edges, though the fire still warmed the chairs and the rug in the centre of the room. She finished a row of knitting and set it down for a moment, stretching her fingers. Her husband folded the newspaper and set it on the small table beside his chair. He looked across at her in the firelight. The lines at the corners of his eyes deepened in the way they did when he was about to smile at her. He did not say anything. She smiled back. They did not need to speak. Around 9:30, he stood up slowly, the way he always did at this hour. He stretched his back, hands on his hips. He said he was going up. She nodded. He came over and kissed the top of her head and said he would be in bed in a few minutes. She said she would come up soon. He went upstairs. She heard his footsteps on the wooden treads, the third step from the bottom creaking as it always did, then the floor of the upstairs hall, then the bathroom door closing, then the sound of water running in the basin, the familiar small sounds of the house preparing itself for sleep. She stayed in the parlour for a little while longer. This was her own quiet time, the half hour at the end of the day that belonged to no one but herself. She set down the knitting. She moved the screen in front of the fire to keep the embers safe. She turned off the radio with a small click and the room went still, and she could hear the wind in the trees outside and the small ticking of the cooling stove in the kitchen and the soft breathing of the house all around her. She walked through the rooms one more time before going up. Through the dining room, where she straightened the chairs and made sure the table was clean. Through the kitchen, where she checked that the back door was locked, that the window above the sink was closed, that the stove was banked properly for the night. She paused for a moment in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at it. The room she had moved through so many times. The room that had been the centre of her day. It looked very still and very clean in the soft light of the single lamp she had left on. The kettle was on its hook. The dish towels were folded over the rod. The floor was swept. The morning kindling was already laid in the wood box beside the stove. Everything was ready for tomorrow. She turned off the kitchen lamp. The room went dark and the only light in the downstairs of the house was now the small lamp in the front hall. She walked through the hall, paused to lock the front door, paused to turn the porch light off, looked out the small window in the door for a moment at the empty street, the street lamps glowing yellow at intervals, the houses all dark or with only their porch lights on, the whole neighbourhood gone quietly to sleep around her. She turned off the hall light. The house was now in darkness except for the soft glow of the bedroom light upstairs. She climbed the stairs slowly, holding the banister, the third step from the bottom creaking under her foot, the second step from the top creaking too, the small familiar music of going up to bed. At the top of the stairs she paused at the door of the children's room and listened, the small soft breathing of 2 children asleep. She opened the door silently and went in. She straightened the blankets on the youngest bed, where they had been kicked half off. She picked up a stuffed rabbit from the floor and put it back on the pillow beside the small sleeping head. She bent and kissed the warm forehead of each child, very softly so as not to wake them. The youngest stirred a little but did not wake. The middle child did not stir at all. She went out, closed the door silently behind her, and stood for a moment on the dark landing, breathing. The hall was warm. The floor under her feet was solid and familiar. The whole house was settling around her, sighing into its night quiet, the way an old house sighs, the small creaks and settlings of wood and plaster easing towards stillness. She paused outside the oldest room. She did not go in. The light beneath the door was already off. She could hear the soft breathing inside. She stood for just a moment. her hand on the doorframe, simply listening, simply being there. Then she moved on toward her own bedroom at the end of the hall. In her bedroom, her husband was already under the covers, with a small lamp on the bedside table casting a low gold pool of light. He was reading a book, propped up on his elbow. He looked up when she came in and smiled. She closed the door behind her and began the small, slow rituals of preparing for bed. She unpinned her hair and let it fall down her back. She brushed it slowly, 100 strokes, the way her mother had taught her to brush her hair, the way she had brushed her own daughter's hair when she was small. She rubbed cold cream into her face, into the small lines around her eyes, into the soft skin at the corners of her mouth. She wiped her face clean with a small linen cloth. She changed into her nightgown, the plain cotton one with the small lace at the collar, the one she had worn for years and that was beginning to be soft from many washings. She turned out the light at her dressing table. She walked over to the bed in the dim light from her husband's lamp, and she pulled back the covers and she got in beside him. The bed was warm. The sheets were clean. Her husband set down his book and turned out his lamp, and the room went into the deep, soft dark of a bedroom at night. They lay there for a minute, just breathing, settling, letting the day fall away. He reached for her hand under the blanket and held it for a moment. She gave his hand a small squeeze and he gave hers back. He turned over toward the wall, the way he always slept. She turned over toward the window, the way she always slept. And they lay there, back to back, warm against each other through the cotton of their nightclothes, settling towards sleep. Outside the window the wind had risen a little, and she could hear it moving through the elm tree in the backyard, a soft, long, shushing sound that always lulled her. The window was open a crack at the top, and a small breath of cool night air came in, and the curtains lifted slightly and fell back. Somewhere far off a dog barked once, then was quiet. A car went by on the next street over, slowly. The radiator in the corner of the bedroom clicked softly as it cooled. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. The whole town was quiet. The whole world, as far as she could feel from her warm bed, was quiet. She thought for a moment about the day, about the small things she had done, the breakfast cooked, the laundry hung, the lunch packed, the garden tended, the supper made, the children read to, the dishes washed, the fire built, the house locked up. All the small rituals of the day were done, and they had been done well, and there was nothing left for her to do tonight, nothing left to think about, nothing left to worry about. The day was finished, and tomorrow would come in its own time, and she did not need to meet it just yet. She closed her eyes. She felt her body sink into the mattress, into the warm, familiar shape it knew, into the small hollows that had been worn into the bed by years of the same sleeping. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands relaxed. Her breath grew slower, deeper. She thought she might say a small prayer, the way she did most nights, and she began to in her mind, but the prayer trailed off into something softer, into a kind of wordless gratitude, into the simple feeling of being home, being safe, being warm, being loved. The wind in the elm tree shushed gently outside the window. The curtains lifted and fell. The house settled one more time, a small creak from somewhere overhead, then silence, and she drifted slowly, deeply, into the long, quiet sleep of a woman who had done her work and done it well and could rest now until the morning. A year in such a household had a shape that you could feel in your bones if you lived it long enough. Each season had its own work, its own light, its own small family of tasks that came around every 12 months, as reliably as the geese flying overhead. Spring began with mud, with the soft thawing of the ground, with the first run of meltwater along the gutters, with the dark, damp earth showing through the last patches of snow in the backyard. Spring began with the smell of the soil waking up, that particular brown smell that means the year is turning. Spring began with the careful peeling back of the burlap that had been wrapped around the rosebush near the front porch, with the inspection of the canes for winter damage, with the small green buds along the willow at the edge of the yard. In spring she opened the windows for the first time on a warm afternoon in early April, and she let the stale winter air out of the house and the fresh damp spring air in, and she beat the rugs out on the back porch railing, and she shook the curtains, and she did the spring cleaning that her mother had taught her to do every year, top to bottom, scrubbing the woodwork and washing the windows inside and out and turning the mattresses and laundering everything that could be laundered. The house emerged from the long winter feeling lighter, brighter, more alive, the way a person feels after a long cold has finally broken. She started the seedlings on the windowsills. She walked the garden beds and planned the year's planting. She bought new chicks from the feed store, fluffy yellow peeps that lived in a wooden box in the kitchen for 2 weeks under a heat lamp, peeping constantly, comically alive, before they were big enough to go out to the chicken coop and join the older hens. The first crocuses came up along the south side of the house, then the daffodils, then the tulips, then the hyacinths with their thick purple spikes and their drowning sweet smell. The forsythia bloomed against the back fence, a great yellow burst of blossoms that meant the worst of winter was truly behind. Easter fell somewhere in this stretch, with its lilies on the church altar and its boiled eggs coloured with food dye on the kitchen table on the Saturday afternoon. The children pressing crayon designs onto the still warm shells, before lowering them into the bowls of pink and blue and green dye. The Easter dinner was usually a ham, baked slowly in the oven all morning while the family was at church, glazed with a mixture of brown sugar and mustard, and a little of the pineapple juice from the tin of pineapple rings, served with scalloped potatoes and green beans, almondine and hot cross buns from the bakery downtown. Summer came on in a long, slow build, getting greener and warmer and longer of day each week through May and into June. Summer was the great, loud, abundant season. The garden in full production, the chickens laying every day, the porches in constant use, the children outside from breakfast until sunset, riding their bicycles up and down the alley, playing in the sprinklers when she set up the hose for them, gathering at the corner with the neighbourhood children for endless games of tag and Red Rover and capture the flag. She rose earlier in summer because the light woke her earlier, and she loved the early summer mornings, the cool half hour before the heat of the day began, when she could go out into the garden in her housecoat and her slippers, and pull a few weeds and pick a few beans and stand for a moment under the apple tree listening to the birds. The kitchen was hot in summer because of all the canning, but she had learned ways to manage. She did the canning early before the day got hot. She kept the back door propped open with a cast-iron flat iron used as a doorstop to let the heat out and the breeze in. She drank glass after glass of cool water from the pitcher in the icebox. She wiped her face with a cool cloth 12 times an hour. The summer evenings were long and lit with that particular gold light that lasts until almost 10 in late June. Supper could be simple in summer, a cold supper, often. Sliced ham and cheese and homemade bread, and a salad from the garden and a pitcher of iced tea, or a quick supper, scrambled eggs and bacon, or a tomato sandwich on toasted bread. The simple meals of long warm evenings when no one wanted to be in the kitchen for more than a few minutes. After supper, the family sat on the front porch, sometimes for hours, while the children chased fireflies across the lawn, and the neighbours waved from their own porches, and the streetlights came on one by one along the avenue. Autumn came on suddenly, the way it always did, in some second week of September when the air shifted and there was a new coolness in the morning that had not been there the day before. The maples along the avenue began to turn within a week of that first cool morning, the green leaves blushing at the edges, then deepening, then exploding into the great fire of October, when the whole street was orange and red and gold, and the leaves rained down on the sidewalks, and the children walked through them on their way to school in their new full coats. Autumn was the great gathering season. The garden produced its last great burst, the squashes and pumpkins ripening on their vines, the late tomatoes hanging heavy on the spent plants, the apples in the small backyard tree turning red and ready for picking. She and the children spent long Saturdays harvesting and processing what was left. They picked apples and made applesauce and apple butter and apple pies. They picked pumpkins and made pumpkin puree to freeze in jars for pies later in the year. They pulled up the last of the carrots and the beets and the onions and laid them in their cool, dim places in the cellar. Halloween was a small ritual, with carved pumpkins on the front porch and candies given out to the few children who came to the door, costumes made at home from old sheets and old hats and a little theatre paint. Then Thanksgiving, the great November feast, the turkey roasted slowly all morning, the cornbread stuffing made from her mother's recipe, the cranberry sauce made fresh from cranberries simmered with sugar and orange peel, the pies, 3 of them at least, pumpkin and apple and pecan, and the long, slow afternoon meal with whatever family could come, the grandmother sometimes, the brother-in-law, the children's friends from school whose own families were far away. Winter then, the slow descent into cold and dark. By December the snow had usually come, the first soft fall that the children watched out the window with their faces pressed to the glass, the first snowman built in the backyard, the first sledding on the small hill in the park 3 blocks over. December was the long preparation for Christmas, the careful saving of every spare moment for the making of small gifts, the knitting of mittens and scarves, the baking of cookies that filled the kitchen with the smells of cinnamon and ginger and butter and vanilla. Christmas Eve with its candlelight service and its tree decorated by the family with the same ornaments her mother had given her when she'd married. Christmas morning with the children's small bright faces and the simple modest gifts, and the long slow breakfast of pancakes and bacon, and a pot of coffee that lasted all morning, while the children played with their new toys on the rug in the parlour. After Christmas, the long deep stretch of January and February, the coldest months, the months when she stayed inside as much as possible, and the world outside was white and grey and silent. The light in those months was different, thin and pale and slanted, the kind of light that made the inside of the house feel especially warm by contrast. She did her indoor work in those months, the deep cleaning, the careful mending of all the small things that had been waiting, the long slow projects, the quilt squares pieced one by one in the evenings, the letters written to old friends, the planning of the next year's garden over the seed catalogues that had begun arriving in the mail. The seasons turned. The seasons would always turn. The world would always come back around through its long, careful cycle of births and deaths, of plantings and harvests, of warm afternoons and cold mornings, of light and dark and light again. She had lived through enough of these cycles by now to know the rhythm in her body, to feel the year in her bones. She did not always notice the turning consciously, but she felt it. She felt it the way you feel the slow change in the angle of light through a window, the slow change in the smell of the wind, the slow change in the small particular things that are different about a particular morning at a particular time of year. The seasons were her clock. The seasons were her calendar. The seasons were the great steady frame within which her life moved, and they would go on turning long after she was gone, and her children would feel them, and her grandchildren would feel them, and the same warm gold of October would come back, and the same cold pale silver of February, and the same green chaos of June, and the same first crocus pushing up through the last patch of snow at the south side of the house, year after year, world without end, the long, slow, unbroken music of a year on earth. Sundays in such a household were different. They had a different texture, a different pace, a different feel. They were the day when the long, careful rhythm of the week loosened, when the house breathed a little more deeply, when even the work that did get done was done more slowly, with more pauses, with more attention to the small pleasures of doing it. The morning began later on Sundays. She let herself sleep in until almost 6, even 6:30 sometimes, which was an indulgence, which was a small private gift to herself at the end of every week. She still rose before the rest of the house, but the kitchen on a Sunday morning felt different from the kitchen on any other day. The light was the same, the smell of coffee was the same. But there was a quietness about it, a sense of nothing pressing that did not exist on weekdays. She did not bother with a big elaborate breakfast on Sundays. The children had cereal, usually, with milk and a little sugar, while their mother and father had coffee and toast and read the Sunday paper at the kitchen table together. The Sunday paper was a thicker paper with the coloured funnies in the back, and a magazine section with longer articles and a crossword puzzle her husband would work on for hours later in the day. They drank their coffee slowly. They passed sections of the paper between them. They commented occasionally on a story they had read. The pace was the pace of nothing. After breakfast, the family got ready for church. This was the Sunday morning ritual, performed with a kind of gentle ceremony. The good clothes were taken out of the closet. The children's hair was combed. Shoes were polished. Hats were chosen. The family walked together to the church, 3 blocks away, in their small Sunday procession, the children on their best behaviour, holding their parents' hands, greeting the neighbours who were also walking to church, all the families converging on the white wooden church at the corner of the avenue. The service had its own slow rhythm, the hymns sung from the worn hymnals, the prayers familiar, comforting in their familiarity, the sermon 20 minutes long, sometimes interesting and sometimes not, but always providing a small still space in the week, a small interval when no one could ask her for anything, when she could simply sit and let her thoughts wander. She often thought about her life during the sermons. She thought about the children, about her husband, about her brother overseas, about her mother and father long dead. She thought about the small problems of the week and let them drift, in the calm light of the church, into a softer perspective. After church, the long lingering on the lawn, the greetings, the small bits of news exchanged, the slow walking home with neighbours and stopping at corners to talk a little more, until finally the family arrived back at their own porch and entered their own house in time for the Sunday dinner, which she had partly prepared the night before and which now needed only its final hour or two of cooking before it would be ready. The Sunday dinner was the central meal of the week. It was the meal that took the most planning, the most preparation, the most attention to detail. A roast, often when the rationing allowed, with all the trimmings, mashed potatoes whipped to perfect smoothness with butter and a little milk, gravy made from the drippings in the pan, thickened with flour seasoned with salt and pepper, a vegetable from the garden in summer or from the pantry in winter, hot rolls baked fresh that morning, a salad sometimes, a green salad in summer, a fruit salad in winter, and a dessert, always a dessert on Sunday, a pie or a cake or a baked pudding. The whole family sat at the dining room table for Sunday dinner. The good plates came out, the ones with the small blue flowers around the rim, the ones that had been her grandmother's. The cloth napkins came out, starched and ironed. The silver was the everyday silver, but it had been polished. A small vase of flowers in the centre of the table, whatever was blooming in the garden or whatever she had bought from the flower stand at the market. The dinner began with grace, said by her husband or sometimes by the oldest child, and then there was the long, slow passing of dishes around the table, and the eating, and the talking, and the laughing, and the second helpings, and the gradual easing back from the table when everyone had had enough. After the dishes were cleared, the long, slow Sunday afternoon began. This was the most relaxed stretch of the week. The children would go off to play, or read, or visit friends. Her husband would settle into his chair with a crossword puzzle and a fresh cup of coffee. She herself would do something quiet that she enjoyed but rarely had time for during the busy week. Reading a novel, writing a long letter to her sister in Ohio, working on a piece of embroidery she had been carrying along for months. Sometimes she would just sit on the front porch with a book in her lap, not really reading, just letting the slow Sunday afternoon move around her, watching the small life of the street, the children chalking hopscotch on the sidewalk, the old man across the way watering his roses, the teenagers from down the block walking by on their way somewhere. In summer, Sunday afternoons sometimes meant a small family expedition, a drive in the car out to a nearby lake or park, with a picnic packed in a wicker basket, sandwiches wrapped in waxed paper, cold chicken from the night before, hard-boiled eggs with a small twist of paper holding salt and pepper, a jar of pickles, a thermos of lemonade. They would spread a blanket under a shade tree and eat slowly, and the children would run off to explore, and she and her husband would lie back on the blanket and look up at the sky through the leaves and feel the deep, particular peace of a summer Sunday with nothing else to do. In winter, the Sunday afternoons were spent indoors mostly, by the fire in the parlour, or playing board games at the dining room table. The family gathered around a checkerboard or a parcheesi board or a deck of cards, or with the radio on and a serial programme playing while everyone half listened and half did their own quiet things. Or with a long nap, the husband stretched out on the couch with a newspaper over his face, the children napping in their rooms, the woman of the house reading in her chair until the book slipped out of her hands and she dozed for an hour. The Sunday supper was simple. Often it was just whatever was left from the Sunday dinner, served cold or briefly reheated. A sandwich made from the leftover roast, a bowl of soup made from the bones, a few sides scraped together from the day's earlier meal. The Sunday supper was a meal that did not require any work, and that was the point of it. The day was a day of rest, and even the cooking was supposed to be lighter on Sunday than on any other day. The Sunday evenings were quiet. The family gathered in the parlour as they did every evening, but on Sunday there was a particular settledness about the gathering, a particular gentleness. The fire was lit, the radio played softly, books were read. The children were sometimes allowed to stay up a little later than usual, because there was no school in the morning. They would sit on the floor by the fire with their parents, and there would be conversation about the week ahead, about plans and possibilities, about the small ordinary anticipations of the days to come. By 8 or 8:30 the children went to bed. Then she and her husband sat in the parlour a little longer, the same as on weeknights, but without the same sense of needing to get to bed early. They read. They talked, sometimes, about the deeper things, the things they did not have time to talk about during the busy week, about their hopes for the children, about their worries, about the small ordinary dreams of two people who had built a life together and who continued to build it day by day, by attention and by care. They did not talk about these things at length. They did not need to. They had years to talk about them, and they would. When they finally went up to bed, the house felt particularly quiet. The Sunday quiet. The deep, patient quiet of a house at the end of a slow, good day. She lay in bed beside her husband and listened to the wind outside and felt the long week ahead, beginning to gather itself in her mind, the small list of tasks for Monday, for Tuesday, for the rest of the week. And she did not mind the gathering, because she had had her day of rest and she was ready, the way Sundays always made her ready, to begin again. If you wanted to understand a woman of that time, you could not really do it without understanding her sewing. Her hands knew sewing. Her hands knew the feel of fabric between her fingers, the small differences between cotton and wool and linen and silk, the way each one moved through her hands and accepted a needle and held a stitch. Her hands had been learning these things since she was a small girl beside her own mother, sitting on a kitchen chair with her feet not quite reaching the floor, holding a small piece of cloth and a threaded needle, and pushing the needle clumsily through, and pulling the thread, and pushing it through again, and slowly, over many years, learning to sew well. There was always a sewing project in progress somewhere in the house, a pile of mending in a wicker basket near her chair in the parlour, accumulating from week to week. A dress in the making, pinned to her dressmaker's dummy in the back bedroom, partly cut out, partly stitched, waiting for the next quiet evening when she could sit down with it again. A quilt in pieces, stored carefully between sheets of tissue paper in a drawer of the dining room sideboard, taken out once a week or so and worked on for an hour. A crochet doily on the small table by the back porch, half finished, the pattern memorised but written down in a small notebook just in case. The mending was the most constant work. The family went through clothes the way families do, with small tears and torn buttons and worn-out elbows and loose hems and split seams, and the mending basket was never empty. She did mending in the evenings, mostly after the children were in bed, sitting by the fire in the parlour with the basket beside her chair and her sewing kit on her lap. The sewing kit was a small wooden box with a hinged lid and many compartments, holding her good needles in a small pincushion, her threads on small wooden spools, her thimbles, her small sharp embroidery scissors with their stalk-shaped handles, her pins, her small jar of buttons, her tape measure rolled into a tin can. She would take a torn shirt out of the basket and look at it carefully under the lamp. She would assess the damage, decide on the approach. A small split seam along the shoulder, easily fixed with a few quick stitches. A button torn off the front needing to be sewn back on with the right thread. A worn place at the elbow that needed to be patched, perhaps with a piece of fabric from her rag bag, perhaps with a small, carefully placed reinforcement of stitching. She would thread her needle, square the fabric in her hands, and begin. The needle moved in and out of the cloth in the small, steady rhythm that she knew so well, the work that did not require thought, the work that her hands could do while her mind drifted elsewhere. She mended socks too, which was a particular kind of sewing called darning. She had a small wooden mushroom-shaped tool, a darning egg, that she would push into the toe or heel of the sock to stretch the hole flat, and then she would weave new threads back and forth across the hole, building up a small new patch of fabric where the old one had worn through. She used a heavy darning thread, in colours that approximately matched whatever sock she was working on. Black for the husband's work socks, brown for the children's school socks, white for everyone's summer socks. The darning was satisfying work, repetitive and precise, and she could do it almost without looking after enough years of practice. She made some of the children's clothes herself, especially the daughters' dresses. There was no money to buy a new dress every time the girl outgrew one, and besides, she liked making them. She would buy a few yards of fabric at the dry goods store, choose a pattern from the Simplicity catalogue, or sometimes adapt one of her own old patterns, and over a couple of evenings she would cut out the pieces, lay them on the dining room table, sew them together on her treadle sewing machine in the back bedroom. The treadle made a pleasant rhythmic sound, a soft clack, as her foot pumped the pedal and the needle drove up and down through the fabric. She'd had the machine for 15 years. It had been a wedding present. It had made dozens of dresses, dozens of curtains, dozens of small projects of every kind. She made curtains for the windows. She made tablecloths and napkins. She made aprons for herself, the kind that crossed in the back and tied around the waist, with deep practical pockets in the front. She made the children's pyjamas, sewn from soft flannel in winter and from light cotton in summer. She made bibs for the youngest when she'd been a baby. She made handkerchiefs for her husband by hemming small squares of fine linen. Quilting was her deeper work, the slow, patient work that she did over months and years. She had several quilts in various stages of completion at any given time. The piecing came first, the careful cutting of small squares and triangles from her rag bag of fabric scraps, the arranging of them on the dining room table to make the patterns, the slow stitching of the pieces together one by one to make the long strips, then sewing the strips together to make the full quilt top. This work could take a year or more depending on the pattern. A simple 9-patch was relatively quick. A double wedding ring or a Dresden plate could take several years of patient work, an evening here, an afternoon there, the slow accumulation of pieces into the great whole. When a quilt top was finished, the next stage began. The quilting itself, the stitching of the 3 layers together, the top, the batting in the middle, the backing on the bottom, all bound together with small even stitches that made the patterns of the quilting itself, the small designs of swirls and feathers and parallel lines that you could feel with your fingers when the quilt was finished. The quilting was traditionally done with several women working together, around a quilting frame in someone's parlour, the great wooden frame holding the quilt taut while the women sat around its edges and stitched. She had been to many such quilting bees over the years, and she had hosted some at her own house, with her best friends from the neighbourhood gathered around, drinking tea, talking, sewing for hours. When the quilting was done, the binding was sewn around the edges, and the quilt was finished. Each quilt was its own world. Each quilt held the histories of all the fabrics that had gone into it, the small squares cut from old dresses and old curtains, and old pieces of clothing that had been outgrown or worn out. Looking at one of her quilts, she could remember every fabric. This piece from her own wedding dress, used for one small section. This piece from her daughter's first Easter dress. This piece from a shirt of her father's, kept after he died and finally sewn into the great quilt where it would be held forever. The quilts were memory, sewn into batting and stitched into permanence, made to be slept under by the people she loved. She was teaching her daughter to sew now, the way her own mother had taught her. The girl was 12, old enough to handle a needle properly, eager to learn. They sat together on Sunday afternoon sometimes, in the parlour by the window, with 2 small projects on their laps. The girl was working on a small embroidered sampler, the same kind of sampler her mother had made at her age, and her grandmother before her, the alphabet stitched in red thread across the top, a small verse in the middle, the year and the girl's own name at the bottom. The sampler would take many months to finish. The mother sat beside her and answered her questions and showed her how to make the small, careful satin stitches and how to take the rough back of the work and turn it neatly so the stitches were nearly invisible from the wrong side. She thought sometimes, watching her daughter sew, about all the women back through her own family who had taught their daughters this same skill. Her own mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, somewhere back in the old country before the family had crossed the ocean. Each generation passing down the small particular knowledge of how to sew well, how to hold a needle, how to make a strong seam, how to mend a tear so it would hold for years. The knowledge moved through women like a small steady stream, generation to generation, never marked in any official record, never appearing in any history book, but kept alive nonetheless, because the work itself kept it alive, because every dress that was sewn, and every shirt that was mended, and every quilt that was finished was a small renewal of the long thread. The hands that sewed were her hands, the same hands that kneaded bread and stirred soup and pulled weeds in the garden and bandaged scraped knees and brushed her daughter's hair. Her hands had done so much over the years. They had become rough in places, calloused from work. The nails kept short and clean but plain, the fingers slightly thickened at the knuckles. They were not the smooth white hands of a lady of leisure. They were the hands of a woman who had used them, every day of her adult life, in the long, careful service of her family. and she did not regret what they had become. She was proud of them in a way she did not often think about. They were good hands. They were strong. They had made and mended and held and tended 1,000 things. They had earned the small lines and the small scars they carried. She held her own hand up sometimes, in the lamplight after the family was asleep, and turned it slowly back and forth and looked at it as if it belonged to someone else. The hand of the woman she had become. The hand that had grown gradually from the soft hand of a girl into the working hand of a wife and mother. She thought of her own mother's hand, which she remembered so vividly. The same kind of hand, only older, more weathered, with the same small particular shape that she now saw beginning to appear in her own. She thought of her own daughter's hand, still soft, still small, still the hand of a girl, and she thought about how time worked, how the hand of a girl became the hand of a woman, how the hand of a woman became the hand of a grandmother, how the small skills passed from one set of hands to another, how the long quiet labour of women's hands was the secret history of every family and of every household, and of the whole world really, if anyone ever stopped to think about it. Most people did not stop to think about it. That was all right. The hands kept working anyway. The dresses kept being made, the mending kept being done, the quilts kept being pieced together, the small squares of memory stitched together one by one and laid over the beds of the children, and warming them through the long cold nights of winter, year after year, generation after generation, the small unending love of women's hands. If you asked her in the late afternoon what she had done with her life, she might have struggled to answer. Not because there was nothing to say, because there was so much, so densely packed and so quietly accumulated that no short answer could begin to gather it. She had not done what was thought of as great things. She had not been to college. She had not had a career. She had not travelled far from her hometown. She had not written books or made speeches or led organisations. By the standards of the wider world, she would not appear in any record. The histories of the country would not name her. The encyclopedias would have no entry for her. She would pass through the long story of the nation without leaving any official trace. And yet, she had done so much. She had kept a household for nearly 20 years. She had fed her family 3 meals a day, every day, for those 20 years, which was something like 20,000 meals, prepared by her hands, served from her stove, eaten at her table. She had washed and folded countless thousands of pieces of laundry, hung them in the sun, ironed them, put them away. She had cleaned 10,000 dishes. She had swept 50,000 floors. She had answered, over the years, an unimaginable number of small questions from small mouths, soothed an unimaginable number of small hurts, kissed an unimaginable number of small foreheads. She had grown food. Year after year, she had turned packets of seeds into rows of vegetables that fed her family. She had preserved that food, hundreds of jars at a time, year after year, and stored them in her pantry, and used them to keep the family fed through every winter. She had nurtured her chickens, gathered their eggs, knitted them new fences when they wandered. She had loved a man for many years, and she had been loved by him in return. She had lived with him in the small daily intimacy of a long marriage, the kind of intimacy that no one outside the marriage could quite understand, the kind of intimacy that was made of 10,000 small kindnesses and 10,000 small forgivenesses, a marriage that had grown, year by year, into something that fit them both like a comfortable old coat. She had raised 3 children. She had been the daily steady presence of their lives. She had been there when they came home from school every day. She had been there when they were sick. She had been there when they had small triumphs and small disappointments. She had taught them, by her example, more than by anything she said, how to be patient, how to be kind, how to keep going, how to make a home, how to take care of the people you love. She had been a friend to the women on her street. She had been a daughter to her parents until they had died. She had been a sister to her brother. She had been a member of her church and her community. She had played her small part in every small ritual that held her town together, the picnics and the funerals and the weddings and the welcomings, all the small social fabric that nobody noticed but that everyone depended on. She had carried a war, without ever leaving her kitchen, by staying steady, by writing letters, by praying, by being the home that her brother and her nephew and the boys on her street were trying so hard to come back to, the home that had to be there, intact, when they returned, the home that did not collapse into worry or despair, no matter how heavy the news, because someone had to keep it standing, and that someone was her. She had done all of this, and it had not felt like much most days. It had felt like ordinary life. She had not thought of herself as a hero, or an artist, or a saint. She had thought of herself simply as a woman doing what needed to be done. A woman who got up every morning and went about her day. A woman who took care of the people she loved. A woman who tried to be kind. A woman who hoped, mostly, to make her small corner of the world a little warmer, a little safer, a little more livable for the people who shared it with her. And yet, looking at it from a certain angle in a certain late afternoon light, you could see that what she had done was not small at all. You could see that the small daily acts of care accumulated over 20 years made up something very large. A household run, a family raised, a community kept, a history of love, written nowhere in books but everywhere in the bones and memories of the people she had loved. The children would carry her with them. That was, in the end, the great quiet legacy of women like her. The children would grow up and go out into the world, and they would carry her with them. Her voice, repeating the small lessons of childhood. Her recipes, transcribed onto index cards or remembered by heart. Her quilts, sleeping on their beds. Her values, lived out in their own homes and their own marriages and their own care of their own children. She would not be famous, but she would not be forgotten either. She would live on in the small daily lives of the people she had raised and loved. She thought about this sometimes, in the long quiet evenings after everyone was asleep. She did not think about it sentimentally. She thought about it with the quiet, clear gaze of a woman who had done her work and could see it for what it was. She had not been perfect. She had made mistakes. She had been impatient sometimes and tired and irritable and discouraged. But she had kept going. She had kept showing up. She had kept doing the work, and in the end that was perhaps all that anyone could really ask of a life. Not perfection. Just the slow, steady showing up, day after day, with love. The light had grown long now. The sun was westering, the great golden afternoon light slanting through the kitchen window and printing itself on the floor in a long, warm rectangle. The chickens were settling into their coop. The garden was quiet. The children were not yet home from school but would be soon. Her husband would not be home for hours yet. For these few minutes she had the house to herself. She sat at the kitchen table with a final cup of tea. She watched the light move slowly across the floor as the sun descended. She thought about her brother. She thought about her children. She thought about the small particular happiness of a quiet afternoon in her own kitchen, in her own house, in her own life. She did not feel grand about it. She did not feel anything dramatic at all. She felt simply content. She felt at home. She felt that she was where she was meant to be. That was enough. That had always been enough. The simple feeling of being where you were meant to be, doing what you were meant to do with the people you were meant to love, that was the whole secret of a life like hers. That was the secret she had stumbled into without ever quite knowing she had stumbled into it. That was the gift she would not be able to put into words, but that she had been quietly receiving every day for 20 years, in every kneading of bread, and every weeding of garden, and every kissing of a small forehead at bedtime. The light continued to move across the floor. The afternoon began to cool, just slightly, the way late afternoons do. A bird called from somewhere in the elm tree. 3 soft notes, then silence. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She set it in the dish drainer, and she stood at the window for one more long moment, looking out at the garden, at the late light on the leaves, at the small private kingdom of her own backyard. Then she turned and went back to her work, because there was always more work to do, and the children would be home soon, and supper was not yet started. But she carried the long light of that afternoon with her, into the rest of the day, and into the evening, and into the years that would come after. The deep quiet certainty that she had done her work. The deep quiet certainty that she had been loved, and had loved in return. The deep quiet certainty that her life, ordinary though it was, had been good. Some afternoons in the middle of the week, when the house was caught up enough that she could leave it for an hour, she would put on her coat and her hat and walk into town. The town was about half a mile from her house, a few long blocks of houses thinning out into a few short blocks of shops and small businesses. She knew every step of the route. She had walked it 1,000 times. She walked it now, often slowly, with no particular hurry, letting the walk itself be a small pleasure. She would close the front door behind her, take a breath of the outside air, and start down the front walk to the sidewalk. The neighbour across the street might wave from her own porch. She might wave back. She would turn left at the gate and head toward the corner. The houses she passed in the first block were all familiar to her, and she could have told you about each one. The Chapmans, who had lived there for 30 years and whose roses were the best on the street. The Pratts, whose son had gone to Italy and not yet returned. The Nielsens, whose youngest had just gotten engaged. The leaves crunched under her shoes if it was autumn. The snow was packed down on the sidewalk if it was winter. The first soft grass was greening at the edges if it was spring. The summer heat rose from the pavement if it was summer. Each season made the walk into town slightly different, and she liked the smallness of those differences, the way the same walk could feel like a different walk depending on the time of year. At the corner she would turn onto the main street, and the houses would give way to small businesses. The grocer was first. She would often stop in just to see what had come in this week, even if she did not need anything. The smell of the grocery store was particular, a smell of sawdust on the wooden floors and ground coffee in the bin behind the counter, and a faint sweetness from the candy jars by the register, and the sharp tang of the cheese in the glass case along the wall. The grocer himself, a bald, round-faced man named Mr. Olson, would lift his hand in greeting when she came in, and he would say "Good afternoon, Mrs." by her last name, and she would say the same to him. They had known each other for 15 years. Their conversation was always the same, the small, comfortable conversation of two people whose lives intersected weekly, without ever quite touching beyond the counter. She might buy a pound of coffee, she might buy a wedge of cheese, she might buy a sack of flour or a pound of sugar if her ration book allowed. She would tell him to put it on her account, and he would nod and write it down in his small notebook, and she would carry the small bag out under her arm and she would walk on. Past the grocer was the butcher shop. Past that was the bakery, with its window full of fresh loaves and its steam fogging the glass on cold mornings. Past that was the drugstore on the corner, with its long marble counter and its swivel stools and its display of magazines and its shelves of small cosmetics and remedies. She might stop in for a bottle of aspirin or a tube of toothpaste or a small box of bobby pins. She might pause for a minute by the magazine rack and look at the covers of the women's magazines, the bright photographs of impossibly cheerful women holding plates of cookies, the headlines about new recipes and new fashion and new ways to keep house. She did not buy the magazines often. They were too expensive, but she liked looking at them. Across the street from the drugstore was the dry goods store, where she sometimes bought fabric and thread and buttons and ribbons. The dry goods store had bolts of fabric standing up along the walls, all the way to the ceiling, in every colour and pattern. She loved the dry goods store. She would walk slowly along the rows of fabric, letting her hand trail across the bolts, feeling the different weights and textures, looking at the colours. A bright cotton in red and white check would catch her eye, and she would imagine a kitchen apron made from it. A soft wool in heather grey would catch her eye, and she would imagine a winter dress for her daughter. She did not always buy, but she always looked, and she always felt, walking out of that store, a small refreshing of something in her, the way a person feels refreshed by looking at a beautiful garden, even if they cannot take any of the flowers home. Beyond the dry goods store was the post office, a small brick building with a green awning over the door. The post office was always one of her stops. She would go in and check the family's mailbox, a small brass door with a small brass dial, the combination of which she knew by heart. She would open it slowly with that small particular hope that always came with opening a mailbox. There might be a letter today. There might be news from somewhere far away. The mailbox might hold a small bright surprise, the kind that could turn an ordinary afternoon into something more. Most days there was only the usual: bills, a circular from a department store, a church bulletin, a copy of the weekly farm magazine her husband subscribed to. But sometimes, perhaps once or twice a month, there was a letter from her sister in Ohio, a letter from her aunt in Pennsylvania, a letter from her brother overseas, a letter from a cousin who was in nursing school in Chicago. The letters were treasures. She would tuck them into her coat pocket and save them for later, for a quiet half-hour when she could sit down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and read them slowly. Across the street from the post office was the library, a small Carnegie library built of brick at the turn of the century, with stone steps leading up to a heavy wooden door. The library was one of her favourite places in town. She would go in and breathe the particular smell of a library, the deep, dusty, quiet smell of old books and waxed wood and slow time. She would walk through the stacks slowly, with her head tilted to read the spines, looking for a novel to take home. She read mostly novels in the evenings, after her sewing was done, when she finally allowed herself to sit and read for half an hour before bed. She liked thick novels best, the kind that had a whole world inside them, the kind that would last her 2 or 3 weeks. She'd read many of the great novels of the previous century in this way, working her way through the library shelves over the years. Dickens, Austen, Eliot, Tolstoy, Hardy. The librarian, Miss Pratt, knew her tastes, and would sometimes hold a new acquisition for her under the counter if she thought it might suit. She would check out her book 2 or 3 at a time and slip them into the canvas bag she carried. The bag would grow heavy as she walked back through town toward home. The book in the bag was its own small treasure, the promise of evenings to come, of warm hours by the fire with her shoes off and the lamp turned to its brightest, lost in someone else's world. The walk home was slower than the walk into town. She was tired. The bag was heavy. The afternoon was getting on. The light was changing. She would pass the same houses in reverse order, in the now slanting light, and she would see different small things than she had seen on the walk-in. A child she had not noticed before sitting on a porch step, a cat in a window, a spray of flowers in a side yard that she had walked past coming the other direction without noticing. The walk home was always a little softer than the walk in, a little more contemplative, a little more given to noticing small things. By the time she reached her own gate, the afternoon was well advanced. The children would be home from school in another half hour. She would have just enough time to put away her purchases, hang up her coat, set the kettle on for tea, and sit down for a few minutes before the small storm of the after-school hour began. She loved these walks into town. They were not glamorous. They were not exotic. They were a half hour of walking back and forth through the same small streets, doing the same small errands, seeing the same familiar faces. But they were her own time. They were a small piece of the day that did not belong to anyone else. They were a moving meditation, a slow, careful claiming of the world outside her house, a way of staying connected to the larger life of the town. She would have missed them if she'd not had them, and on the days when she was too busy to take a walk into town, when the laundry was too heavy or the canning was too pressing, or one of the children was sick at home, she would feel a small quiet ache by the end of the day, a sense of something missed. The walks were small, the walks were ordinary, but the walks were one of the small good things, the small quiet things that made a life feel like a life, and not just a series of tasks. She had learned, over the years, that a life needed such things. A walk in the afternoon, a book by the fire, a cup of tea in a quiet kitchen, a small flower from the garden brought into the house and set in a glass on the windowsill. The small good things did not announce themselves. They did not look like much, but they were the threads that held everything else together. They were the small, soft places to land in the middle of a long working day. They were the little pleasures that kept the larger work bearable, year after year. And she'd grown to honour them, to make space for them, to walk into town when she could, even if it was only for half an hour, even if she did not buy anything, even if all she did was walk. Letters were how the world stayed in touch with itself in those years. The telephone existed, of course, and was used for local calls, but long-distance calls were expensive and saved for emergencies, for news of births and deaths, for the rare special occasions when something had to be said immediately. The everyday work of staying connected with people who lived far away was done by letter, by thin paper folded into envelopes, by stamps licked and pressed onto the corners, by the slow patient passage of words across the continent at the speed of trains and trucks and small post office routes. She wrote many letters. She had a regular correspondence with her sister in Ohio, who had married a farmer and moved away when she was 20, and who now wrote a letter every 2 weeks like clockwork, 10 pages or more sometimes, in her sister's familiar slanted handwriting, full of the small details of a farm life that her own city sister loved to read about. The early lambs, the new tractor, the hired man who had finally married the girl from the next farm over, the repairs to the kitchen, the quilt her sister was working on, the farm dog who had had puppies again. Her sister's letters were like small windows into a different life, a parallel life she might have lived if her own choices had gone differently, and she read them slowly twice each, savouring the particular voice of her sister coming through every line. She wrote back at the same pace, every 2 weeks, the small ritual of their continuing connection across hundreds of miles. She wrote at the dining room table, at night usually, after the supper dishes were done and the children were in bed. She would take out a fresh sheet of paper from the box of stationery she kept in the sideboard drawer, and she would unscrew the top of her fountain pen, and she would begin. She wrote slowly, the way she did most things, with care, choosing each word, making sure her handwriting was neat. She told her sister about the children, who had grown another inch this month, who had said something funny at supper, who was struggling with a particular subject at school. She told her sister about the garden, what was coming up, what was failing. She told her sister about the small bits of news from the neighbourhood. She told her sister, sometimes, about the news from the war, about her brother's last letter, about her worries. The letters were a kind of conversation, a slow conversation, with weeks between each turn, but a conversation nonetheless, a conversation that had been going on between the two sisters for nearly 20 years, since they had been parted by marriage, and that would presumably go on until one of them died. The letters were the proof that the bond between sisters did not need to be physical to be real. The letters were the proof that two women, separated by 1,000 miles, could still know each other intimately, by the patient, careful work of writing and being written to, week after week, year after year. She also wrote to her aunt in Pennsylvania, a less frequent correspondence, but a steady one, every month or so. Her aunt was in her 70s now, a widow living alone in the small town where her mother's family had come from. The aunt's letters were shorter than the sisters', with a more elderly hand, a careful spidery script that became a little harder to read every year. The aunt wrote about her garden, about her cat, about the small comings and goings of the small town, about the church gossip, about the slow accumulating losses of being old and watching one friend after another die. The aunt's letters were sometimes a little melancholy, but not in a way that made them unwelcome. They were the letters of a woman who had lived a long life and was now in its final long quiet phase, and they were full of the deep particular wisdom of that phase. She wrote to her aunt with extra care. She tried to be cheerful, but not falsely so. She tried to share news that might genuinely interest the aunt. News of the children mainly, the small triumphs, and the small ordinary milestones. She sent photographs sometimes, small snapshots taken with the family camera and developed at the drugstore, of the children in their Easter clothes, or by the Christmas tree, or in their new school clothes at the start of a new year. The aunt would write back to thank her, and to say how much the photographs meant, how she had set them on her dresser where she could see them every morning, how she could see, in the youngest child's face, the very same look that her own mother had had at 4 years old. She wrote to her brother overseas, of course, every week. We have already seen those letters, the careful, happy letters that tried to bring him home in his mind without bringing him into the news from home. The letters that went out into the great uncertain mail of wartime, that might or might not arrive, that might or might not be read. She wrote them anyway. She wrote them faithfully. She wrote them because she had to, because the writing of them was a small act of love that she could perform at a great distance, that her brother would feel if he received them, in his hand and his heart, like a thin, warm thread reaching across the ocean. Beyond the regular correspondences, there were occasional letters, to a cousin who had moved to California, to an old school friend who had married a banker and lived now in Boston, to whom she wrote once or twice a year as a way of keeping the long thread of a girlhood friendship from breaking, to her father-in-law, who lived in a small town in the next state with his second wife, and who needed regular reassurance that the family was thinking of him, to her mother-in-law, similarly, to various others, in the wider net of relations and old friends and church connections that any woman of her years had accumulated. She kept all the letters she received. They were stored in shoeboxes in the closet of her bedroom, organised by sender, tied with ribbons by year. The shoeboxes were heavy with years of accumulated correspondence, the slow paper records of the long parallel lives being lived alongside her own. Sometimes, on a long winter afternoon when she was alone in the house, she would take down one of the boxes and read through old letters. Letters from her sister from 10 years ago, when the sister's children had been small, when the farm had been new, when their lives had been full of different worries and different small joys. Letters from her aunt from years before her uncle had died, when the aunt was still part of a couple and her letters had been longer and a little more cheerful. Letters from her own mother before she had died. The mother's letters were the most precious. She kept those in a separate small wooden box, and she did not look at them often, because looking at them was painful, but she could not quite bear to put them away forever. Just having them, knowing they were there, was a small comfort. The letters told her, when she read them like this, that her life had been long, that she'd been many people in the course of being herself, that she was the same woman who had received those long letters from her sister in their first years apart, when both of them had been newlyweds, that she was the same woman whose mother had written her funny detailed letters every week before she died, that she had been lived through by herself, by the slow accumulating year by year being of her own life. The letters were the proof. The letters held the years. She wrote one of her own letters that evening after the children were in bed. She sat at the dining room table with her stationery and her fountain pen. She was writing to her sister in Ohio. She wrote slowly, with care, telling her sister about the small things of the week. The youngest had lost a tooth. The middle child had finally grown out of his old shoes and would need new ones next month. The oldest had been chosen for a part in the school play. The garden was producing the last of the tomatoes. The autumn was beautiful this year. The leaves were the brightest she could remember. She wrote a few sentences about her brother. She had had a letter from him last week. He was well. He was tired. He missed home. She did not say more than that. There was not more to say. She closed the letter the way she always closed her letters to her sister, with love, and a small pen drawing of a flower in the bottom corner, the way they had drawn small flowers in the corners of their notes to each other since they had been girls. She folded the letter carefully into thirds. She slipped it into the envelope. She wrote the address. She sealed the envelope and licked a stamp and pressed it into the corner. She set the letter on the small table by the front door, where she would remember to put it in the mailbox in the morning. The letter would travel for 2 days. It would arrive in the mailbox of her sister's farm on a Friday, probably. Her sister would walk down to the mailbox at the end of the long driveway, in her boots, with her dog beside her, and she would open the box and find the letter, and she would smile, and she would carry it back to the farmhouse, and she would set it on the kitchen table to read after the morning chores were done, with her own cup of tea, in her own kitchen, hundreds of miles away. And the long thread between them would have been gently tightened again, by another small turn of the hands of 2 women who had loved each other since childhood, who had built 2 separate lives in 2 separate places, but who had never let go of each other, would never let go, would keep writing back and forth across the great distance between them, for as long as they both had hands that could hold a pen and stamps that could carry words. Sometimes, in the very small hours, she woke, not from any bad dream, not from any noise, only from the slow surfacing that comes to most people, in most lives, at some point in the long middle of any given night. She would open her eyes in the dark, and she would lie very still, and she would listen. The house at 3 a.m. was the most quiet it ever was, the deepest quiet. Quieter than the early evening, quieter than the dawn, quieter than the long gentle Sunday afternoons. At 3 a.m. the house had stopped doing all of its small daytime sounds. The pipes did not knock, the radiators did not click. The icebox motor was running somewhere far off, but its hum was so low and so steady that you stopped hearing it after a few seconds. The clock in the hallway was ticking, very softly, almost too softly to hear unless you really listened. And outside, the world was quieter still. No cars, no voices, no dogs, only the soft long breath of the wind in the elm tree, which sometimes was there and sometimes was not. She would lie in the warm pocket of her bed, with her husband breathing slowly beside her, and she would think for a moment about getting up. Sometimes she did, sometimes she stayed where she was. The choice depended on how awake she felt, and on whether she thought she could go back to sleep, and on whether she felt the small particular pull of a quiet kitchen at 3 a.m, which sometimes called her and sometimes did not. When she did get up, she got up softly. She slid her feet out from under the covers, found her slippers in the dark, slipped on her housecoat that hung on the chair. She crossed the bedroom floor without making a sound, the boards under her feet barely creaking, the old familiar geography of her own room remembered by her body so well that she did not need to see it. She opened the bedroom door slowly, easing the latch back so that it did not click, and stepped out into the upstairs hall. The hall was darker than the bedroom had been. There was no light up here at this hour, not even the small night light in the children's room, which was dimmed because at 3 in the morning even a small light could disturb a sleeping child. She walked down the hall by feel, with one hand trailing along the wall. She paused, as she always did when she came this way at night, by the children's bedroom door. She listened. The slow, soft breathing of 2 children deeply asleep. She moved on. The stairs creaked exactly where they always creaked, in the same 2 places, and she stepped on each creaking board as she always did, because there was no avoiding them, but the creaks were soft enough that no one ever woke. She came down into the front hall. She turned left into the parlour. She turned right into the dining room. She crossed the dining room and pushed open the swinging door into the kitchen. The kitchen at 3 in the morning was a kind of small private cathedral. The light from the street lamp at the corner came through the kitchen window and laid a soft pale rectangle across the floor. Everything in the room was outlined gently, half in light and half in shadow. The kettle on the stove, the dish towels folded on the rod, the line of canisters along the counter, the chairs neatly pushed in around the table. The room was perfectly still. The room was perfectly hers. She did not turn on the overhead light. The street lamp was enough. She moved through the kitchen by its soft pale glow, the way a person moves through a familiar room in moonlight, by memory and by hand. She filled the kettle from the tap very slowly, so the rush of water would not be loud. She set the kettle on the back of the stove and turned the gas on low. The small blue ring of flame appeared underneath, soft and steady. She watched it for a moment. There was something hypnotic about a low flame seen in the dark. She got down a cup from the cupboard. She got down the small canister of chamomile tea she kept for nights like this. She did not want coffee. She did not want anything strong. She wanted only the soft warmth of a cup of something gentle in her hands, while the world outside was still asleep. While she waited for the kettle to come to a quiet boil, she stood at the kitchen window. The street outside was utterly still. The houses across the way were dark, every one of them. The street lamp on the corner cast its pale pool of light over the empty pavement. A single car was parked at the curb 3 houses down, its dark shape softened by the night. Above the rooftops, the sky was deep, deep blue, almost black, with a few stars showing through despite the street lamp. She could see the slow drift of a thin cloud across the moon, which was almost full tonight, riding low in the western sky. There was a deep particular peace in being awake at this hour. The day did not exist at 3 in the morning. The list of things to do did not exist. The small tensions of the household did not exist. Nothing existed except the cool, quiet kitchen, and the woman in it, and the slow rising warmth of the kettle, and the long, deep stillness of the world outside. She thought sometimes about her own mother during these late kitchen hours. Her mother had also been a woman who sometimes got up in the night. She remembered as a child waking to use the bathroom and seeing the soft yellow line of light under the kitchen door downstairs, and knowing that her mother was in there, and feeling, even at 6 or 7 years old, a deep sense of safety from that knowledge. Her mother was up. Her mother was awake. Her mother was watching over the house in some quiet way that a child did not need to understand. She would go back to bed. She would fall asleep again easily. The world had her mother in it, and her mother was awake at 3 in the morning, and that was enough. She wondered sometimes if her own children would carry the same memory. Probably so. Probably the small, soft sound of her own footsteps at 3 in the morning, the quiet, distant clink of a kettle being set on the stove, the faint smell of tea drifting up the stairs, would lodge itself into their childhood memories without their realizing it, and would surface in their own minds some day, when they were grown and had their own children, and were sometimes awake themselves at 3 in the morning. The chain of mothers, awake in kitchens, watching over sleeping houses, going back through generations and generations. The kettle began to whisper, not whistle yet. Whistle was too loud at this hour. She turned off the flame just before the whistle could begin, and lifted the kettle, and poured the hot water over the chamomile in her cup. The dry flowers began to swell and turn the water pale gold. The faint sweet smell of chamomile rose up to her face. She carried the cup to the kitchen table and sat down. She held the cup in both hands. The warmth seeped slowly into her palms. The tea was too hot to drink for a few minutes. She did not mind. She liked just sitting with the warm cup in her hands in the dark, watching the steam rise from it. She thought, at this hour, about all kinds of things. Sometimes about her brother overseas, and she would say a small silent prayer for him and feel a small ache, and then let it pass. Sometimes about the children, just a soft, warm thinking about them, what they had been like at supper, what they had said before bed, the particular small expressions on their faces at certain moments of the day. Sometimes about her husband, asleep upstairs, the long shape of him under the covers, the way his hand had reached for hers under the blanket before they fell asleep, the way he had held it for just a moment before turning toward the wall. Sometimes she thought about nothing at all. Sometimes she just sat. Sometimes the quiet of the kitchen was so complete that her own thoughts grew quiet too, and she became, for a few minutes, simply a woman sitting in a chair holding a warm cup, not thinking, not remembering, not planning, only being there, only being awake in the small dark hour in her own kitchen, in her own life. These were the deepest times. These were the times that no one else ever saw. These were the small private hours that did not appear in any letter, did not show up in any photograph, did not become part of any story she would ever tell to anyone. They were entirely her own, and they were, in some way she could not have explained, among the most precious hours of her life. The hours when she was only herself, with no one to take care of, no one to be brave for, no one to perform any role for. The hours when she could simply exist in her own kitchen, in the still dark of the world. She drank the chamomile slowly, small sips. The tea cooled in her hands. The warmth moved into her body, slow and gentle. Her shoulders, which had been holding their daytime tension even in sleep, began to drop. Her jaw, which had been set even on the pillow, began to loosen. Her breathing grew slower. The small inner hum of being awake began to quiet. She finished the tea. She rinsed the cup at the sink very softly and set it on the dish drainer. She stood for one more long moment at the window, looking out at the moon and the stars and the empty street. The cloud had moved off the moon now. The moon was bright and full and steady in the western sky. The street lamp glowed yellow. The whole town was asleep. The whole world, as far as she could feel from her quiet kitchen, was asleep. She moved back through the dark rooms of her house, through the dining room, through the parlour, up the stairs, the same 2 creaks under her feet, then the soft floor of the hall. Past the children's room, where she paused again, listening to the slow, soft breathing of 2 sleeping children. Into her own bedroom, where her husband had not stirred. She slipped off her slippers and her housecoat very softly. She laid back the blanket. She slid into the warm bed. He turned slightly in his sleep, the way he sometimes did when she came back to bed. He moved a little toward her. She moved a little toward him. Their bodies fit back together in the long, soft shape they had made together over the years. His warmth surrounded her. The bed surrounded her. The deep, familiar smells of her own pillow and her own blanket surrounded her. She closed her eyes. The wind in the elm tree outside was a long, soft shushing. The moon would set in another hour or 2. The first dawn would come in 3 hours, or 3.5. The slow, pale lift of the eastern sky into grey, then into rose, then into the soft gold of a new morning. She did not need to think about that. She did not need to be ready for it. The morning would come whether she was ready or not, and she would be ready when it came, because she always was. For now, she only needed to sleep. Her breath grew slower, deeper, longer. The small ache of having been awake was already fading. The pull of sleep rose up through her body the way warm water rises through a sponge. She felt herself settling back down into the deep, dark place where sleep lives. She felt her thoughts begin to soften and lose their edges. She felt the small remaining tension in her shoulders, in her hands, in the small muscles of her face all begin to let go. She felt herself become, gradually, only her breathing, only the rise and fall of the warm bed under her, only the slow, soft sound of the wind outside. She slept. The kitchen sat quiet downstairs, still half lit by the street lamp through the window, the empty cup drying on the rack, the kettle cooling on the stove. The house held her, the way the house always held her, in its long, quiet wooden arms. The night held the house, the wind held the night, the moon held the wind, and somewhere far above all of it, in the deep dark sky beyond the elm tree, The stars wheeled slowly through their long, slow turning. The same stars her grandmother had slept under. The same stars her great-grandmother had slept under. The same stars all the women back through all the generations had slept under, in their own quiet houses, in their own quiet lives, going gently about the long, slow business of being a woman in a world that needed her more than it ever quite knew, to keep the small lights burning, to keep the kitchens warm, to keep the children safe through the long, dark passages of every night. Now we will move with her into the slowest part of any day, the part that is sometimes called the final hour, though it is rarely just 1 hour and is rarely just final. The part where the body has done its work and the mind has done its work, and what remains is only the soft, long letting go. Imagine the kitchen one more time. Imagine the soft yellow light of the single lamp she has left burning on the kitchen counter. Imagine the kettle cooling now, its whistle long since gone quiet. Imagine the dish towels folded over their rod. Imagine the chairs pushed in around the table. Imagine the cat asleep in the chair by the back door, curled into a perfect small circle of fur and warmth, his tail tucked over his nose, his breathing so slow that you can barely see his sides rise and fall. Imagine the parlour. The fire in the fireplace has burned down to embers. The screen is in front of it. The deep red glow of the embers shifts very slowly under their soft white skin of ash. The chairs by the fire are empty now. The knitting basket sits beside her chair, with the small navy blue cardigan folded on top, the needles tucked into the wool. The book her husband was reading is laid spine up on the small table beside his chair, holding his place. A clock on the mantelpiece ticks slowly. A bowl of dried rose petals on the side table sends out its faint sweet smell into the cooling room. Imagine the dining room. The table is bare. The white tablecloth has been folded and put away. The candlesticks stand at the centre of the table, the wicks of the candles black from a recent burning, the wax cool and hardened in their small drip patterns down the silver. The chairs are pushed in. The hutch along the wall holds the good plates behind its glass doors, the plates lined up on their wooden runners, gleaming softly in the dim light from the parlour doorway. Imagine the upstairs hall, the faintest light from the bathroom nightlight, the doors of the bedrooms all closed, the soft breathing of 3 children in 2 rooms, the soft breathing of a husband in another room, the slow, settled quiet of a whole family asleep. Imagine the woman of the house, in her own bed now, in the deep dark, slowly drifting towards sleep. We have followed her through her morning. We have followed her through her noon. We have followed her through her afternoon, and her evening, and her late night. Now we will follow her, one last time, into the place where she does not need to be followed, the soft place inside her own head as it begins to soften and slow and let go. She is thinking, but only barely. The thoughts come and go like small drifting clouds. She thinks of the bread she will bake tomorrow. She thinks of the letter she will write to her sister tomorrow. She thinks of the way her youngest looked at her at supper, with that small particular smile, and her chest warms a little at the memory. She thinks of her brother somewhere across the ocean, and she sends him a soft, warm thought across the sea. She thinks of her mother, long gone, and she feels her mother's presence very gently nearby, the way a person sometimes does at the edge of sleep, as if the people who have gone are not really gone, only quieter, only waiting in the next room of some great house that we cannot quite see. The thoughts grow softer. The thoughts grow further apart. There are gaps between them now, gaps of nothing, gaps of soft, warm dark. The breathing slows. The body under the warm blanket has gone very heavy. The hands have unclasped. The face has gone soft. The last small tensions of the long day are all letting go. Outside, the night is very deep. The wind has settled. The moon has moved further west and is now low above the rooftops. The first faint paleness will come to the east in another 2 or 3 hours. But for now there is only deep blue sky and the slow turning of stars and the long quiet of a town fully asleep. A train whistles, very far off, on some distant track that runs through some distant valley, and the whistle is so soft and so far that it might be the memory of a whistle rather than a real one. A dog barks once somewhere blocks away and is quiet. The clock in the hallway ticks. The clock in the parlour ticks. The 2 clocks, just slightly out of rhythm, weave their small, soft music through the house. The radiator in the corner of the bedroom clicks once as it cools, a small, contented sound. The curtains lift slightly at the open window and fall back. A cool current of air moves across the room, very slowly, and lifts the smallest hair at the edge of her temple and settles. She's almost gone now. The dark is rising up around her like warm water. The bed is holding her up the way a small soft boat holds you up in still water. There is no edge anywhere. There is no urgency anywhere. There is no need to be awake. There is no need to remember anything. There is no need to prepare for anything. She lets go. The last small thread of her thinking dissolves. Her breathing grows long and even. Her face is the face of a woman deeply at rest. The small line between her eyebrows, the one that comes from years of small concentration and small worries, has smoothed out. Her mouth is soft. Her hands are loose under the blanket. She is gone, into the long, warm dark, into the soft, deep place where the body finally rests. And we will leave her there. We will leave her in the warm-kept house, in the warm-kept bed, in the warm-kept night. We will leave her sleeping the deep good sleep of a woman who has done her work and done it well. And we will let ourselves drift the same way, carried by her example, carried by the long, slow song of her ordinary day, into our own deep good sleep. The kitchen sits quiet. The fire glows soft. The clocks tick gently. The wind in the elm tree breathes its long, slow breath, and breathes it out again, and breathes it in. The whole house is breathing. The whole street is breathing. The whole town is breathing in its long, slow nighttime way, and we too are breathing slowly, softly, deeply, settling into the same long, warm rhythm. There is nothing to do. There is nowhere to be. There is no list and no task and no concern. There is only this breath, this warmth, this soft dark, this long, deep rest. The night is wide, the night is generous, the night has all the time in the world. The kitchen is still. The kettle is cool. The dish towels are folded. The cat is asleep in his chair. The fire has gone to embers, and the embers have gone to ash. The clock on the mantelpiece ticks slowly, 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 marking off the small soft seconds of the deep middle of the night. The single light she left burning on the kitchen counter casts its warm soft glow across the worn wooden floor. Outside, the street is quiet. The street lamps stand in their patient yellow halos. A small wind moves through the elm tree very softly. The stars wheel slowly through the deep dark sky. The moon is setting, low above the rooftops. Somewhere far away a train passes through the night. Somewhere closer a dog dreams in a kitchen and sighs once and is still. She is sleeping. The husband is sleeping. The children are sleeping. The house is holding them all the way it has held them every night for years in its warm wooden arms. And so we leave the small ordinary world of a woman who lived a long time ago, in a small house, in a small town, in a country that was at war, in a year that has now become history. She did her work, she fed her family, she kept her house, she loved her people. She was a small light in a dark time. She was one of countless such lights scattered across the country, scattered across the world, burning quietly in their kitchens and their parlours and their bedrooms, holding their small warm circles of home together through all the long uncertain years. We do not know her name. We will never know her name. There were millions like her. There were millions of lives like the one we have spent this evening inside. And every one of them mattered, in the small invisible way that the deep work of women always matters, holding the world together by hand, day after day, night after night, with patience and care and love. So let her rest now. Let yourself rest now. Let the long, warm dark hold you the way it holds her. Let the soft breathing of the wind in the elm tree carry you down into your own deep good sleep. There is nothing left to do tonight. The day is done. The light is out. The house is safe. The world will go on without your help for a little while. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep the way she is sleeping, in her warm small bed, in her warm small house, in the year 1943. Sleep the way the cat is sleeping. Sleep the way the children are sleeping. Sleep the way the whole quiet street is sleeping under the slow-turning stars under the wide, wide sky. Good night. Before you drift off completely, here is a small soft question for you to carry into your sleep if you wish. What is one small ordinary thing from your own life or from the life of someone you loved that brought you a quiet sense of being home There is no need to answer. Only let the question rest gently in your mind like a small warm stone in a still pond, and let yourself fall asleep beside it. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to hear more stories like this one, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps so much, and it lets us keep making more of these for you. Good night, sleep well, and we will see you in the next one.